Okay, so now we're at lecture 2. We're going to talk about the early English settlements, get some colonies started, talk about the effects that this has on people, why the colonization was going on. And we talked in the last lecture, we talked about Spain's early colonization and the really horrible reputation that they got for themselves because of their treatment of native people. And that belief that Spain was unusually cruel, that inspired a sense of superiority in their European rivals, in England and France and the Netherlands. This idea that we're going to go over to the New World and we're going to be so much better at it than Spain was. But what really inspired those rivals to actually challenge Spain's success was the money, the precious metals, and the gold and the silver and the turquoise that was just pouring in from the mines in Mexico and in South America. Now, the first real challenger to Spain's authority was France. France and Spain had been rivals for a long time, and so now they're just taking that fight overseas. Now, at first, the French wanted to find gold, and they wanted to locate a northwest passage, that sea route to Asia, that ocean path to Asia. That's what Columbus had originally been trying to find for Spain. But then the French landed in the Americas, decided that was good enough for them. The problem that France faced is there is a northwest passage. If you head to the Arctic, you can actually sail bypass North America. You can sail north of North America in the Arctic and reach Asia that way. But because it's so far north, it's packed with ice. And no one was able to get through that Northwest Passage. Maybe just over 100 years ago. It was the early 1900s. So the little wooden boats that they had in the 1500s, they couldn't do it with those. So then France started to view North America at first as a barrier to what they really wanted, and not as a promising site for settlement. And that affected how France related to the native people that they came in contact with. For most of the 1500s and 1600s, only French explorers and fishermen and fur traders spent much time in North America. Now, when Spain came over, they put down roots immediately. They took the land, they took the people. England, when they get started, they take the land. France, for a while, really wasn't that concerned with taking the land. Now, they would splash their name all over the maps and say, this is what we're claiming. But in practice, they don't really take that much. And so France, for a solid 150 years, really had a much better reputation than most other European countries. They dealt much more fairly with the indigenous population, because rather than seizing land, what they really wanted was to trade. Now, when they do start colonizing in earnest, we will start to see some of the same problems between France and native people that Spain had and that England has. But in the beginning, they were much more cooperative. Now, after reports of Columbus's journey started trickling around to the other kingdoms in Europe, Henry VII kind of kicked himself, Henry VII of England, and decided that he is going to pay for an explorer to head west and see if there's something that can be claimed for England. And that first explorer that England sent was John Cabot. He's a Frenchman. His name is really supposed to be pronounced Jean Cabot, but England never wants to pronounce things the way the French do. John Cabot sailed in 1497. He became the first European since the Vikings in the 900s to reach what is now the northern coast of the United States and southern coast of Canada. But after Cabot's expedition, English exploration and colonization got put on hold for a long time. Like he reported back, in the late 1490s what he had found, and then England just kind of sat on it. And a lot of that is because England isn't really in a position to start building an empire. Empire building, like with Spain, was an extension of a nation sort of being able to consolidate their national power. Spain had done that. Spain had unified their warring regions, kicked out the foreign enemies, unified their religion. Those steps were necessary to being able to spend the money and send troops to a completely different part of the world just on the off chance that they might get something out of it. That gamble paid off for Spain. But for a long time, England couldn't complete those 3 steps to really make that gamble in earnest. In the late 1400s, early 1500s, really from most of that century, the 1500s, England was a second-rate power at best. Most of the 1400s, while Spain was consolidating itself, England spent most of the 1400s in a civil war, the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII had to pacify and unify the country. He thought that he had left it in pretty good hands when he died. He had a son to take over after him. But Henry VIII, number 8, he has other priorities. Henry VIII does. Henry VIII, instead of building on what his father had started, squanders most of the wealth that his father had built up, is not all that interested in using England's military power, and instead of consolidating the country, he kind of tears it apart. Henry VIII almost accidentally launched the Protestant Reformation in England. And when he did that, he launched another century of violence and political upheaval. Now, at first, England was a Catholic country, as all the nations of Western Europe were a Catholic country. Then he decided, and Henry VIII, as defender of the faith, had persecuted Protestants in England. But then he decided to become a Protestant himself so he could divorce his first wife and marry the second wife. And so he became Protestant. The Pope was no longer the head of the church in England. Henry is now the head of the church. So he grants himself his divorce, and then he starts persecuting Catholics. When he dies, after running through 6 wives, when Henry VIII dies, his son becomes king. And his son, Edward, also attacks Catholics. But then Edward dies. He dies when he's like 16 or 17. He's a sickly little kid. And Edward's half-sister, Mary, becomes queen. She is Catholic. So she takes everything that her dad and her brother did, and she completely undoes it, turns the country back on its head. We're going to be a Catholic country again, and we're going to persecute Protestants now. Like when you were kids, some of you are still kids, but did you ever do the Bloody Mary game? You go into the bathroom and you say Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror and something's supposed to come out after you? Mary the First of England is Bloody Mary. She got that nickname because of all the Protestants that she had tortured and burned at the stake during the very brief time that she was queen. Then she dies. She has no children. And her sister, her half-sister, Elizabeth, becomes the queen. Elizabeth is the daughter of wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth is a Protestant. So now we got to go through this whole frickin' deal all over again. Got to change all the churches, got to persecute everybody who's not going to go along with it. That takes up the vast majority of the 1500s. And it's really hard to unify a nation when the rulers can't even agree on what side they want to take, what church they want to go to. Now, Elizabeth also killed people, but she ruled for a nice long time. So she was able to also do other things that she's better known for. Mary only ruled for a few years. So the persecutions were kind of all she accomplished. That's what she's known for. So England is not internally unified in any way. And England also has outside enemies. In some cases, these were enemies that England deliberately picked on, like Ireland. And in some cases, it's countries that were kind of picking on them, like Spain. So it's not until the 1580s, really, very late into the reign of Elizabeth I, that the English were able to even consider trying to start a North American colony. Now, there were Englishmen messing around in the New World. There were fishermen who were going to what is now Canada and New England. There were English pirates, of course, who would raid Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and attack Spanish ships and then give some of the money to the English crown. And in fact, Queen Elizabeth granted the first colonial charter to her favorite pirate, Sir Walter Raleigh. She gave him this charter that would allow him to establish a colony at his own expense somewhere in North America. And he got the money to do it by raiding Spanish ships. It's kind of like poking a badger with a stick at this point. In 1585, Raleigh sent 5 ships and about 100 people, including some of his own family members, to set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is off the coast of northern North Carolina, southern Virginia. Totally coincidentally, I'm sure, Roanoke Island made a great staging area to attack Spanish ships. Later that year, 1585, the governor of Roanoke went back to England to ask for more supplies and to ask for militia, to come and defend them because they are in this kind of vulnerable place. But that supply ship, and that ship full of soldiers to defend them, got caught up in a different event and didn't make it back to Roanoke for a while. Got caught up in one of those events that at the time seems kind of minor, but ended up having profound repercussions. Spain was tired of England attacking their ships and their Caribbean settlements. Spain is also Catholic, and they have wanted to attack England ever since the Protestant Elizabeth became queen. Then Elizabeth refused to marry Spain's king, so they've been insulted, they've been attacked. The Pope is urging them to go after England for Christ and country, and so Spain said, fine, we're going to attack England. They sent their armada, the vast majority of the Spanish Navy, to attack England, get rid of Elizabeth, put a Catholic into power. But while the Spanish armada was off the coast of England, getting ready to attack, a storm came up, and most of their navy was destroyed. Those boats that remained were burned by the English. To the English, this is a great victory. God has granted them, this defense of their nation. But more importantly to us is the loss of almost 200 Spanish ships. Before the Armada, Spain was the #1 naval power in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm going to go ahead and say that they were really the #1 naval power in the world at this point. China could rival them, but they weren't really trying. Spain had surpassed Portugal. They have established colonies in Africa, in the Americas, in Asia. They were controlling all of it with this vast navy, which has now been utterly devastated. And with this one storm, it's like the entire world opened up. Now everyone who wanted colonies in the Americas but couldn't get them because Spain was blocking them, now they can do what they want because Spain doesn't have the navy to stop them anymore. Now the English can sail to North America without 4 gunboats protecting every supply ship. They can sail on their merry way without worrying that a Spanish ship is going to blow them out of the water. Now Spain did rebuild, but in the time that it took them to get back up to speed, England had become the major naval power. They've got a song in England that goes, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves." This little scuffle between a big, powerful country and a piddly little country created a situation where the little country could become the British Empire. And that supply ship that was supposed to go back to Roanoke, it got caught up in this Armada thing. They went off to burn some Spanish ships, took a little bit of damage, so that supply ship didn't get back to Roanoke for 5 years. And when it finally got there, the colony was gone. You may have heard about the lost colony of Roanoke. The people simply weren't there. But there was no evidence of battle. Like, nothing had been damaged, none of the buildings had been burned down, there weren't any fresh graves. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a tree. That was the name of a nearby island, so the English went to that island to see if they could find the Roanoke settlers, but they never found the colonists, and we still don't know what happened to them. But for England, just like for Spain, just like for every other European country, the idea of national glory in building an empire merged with a desire for profit, and with religious zeal to an extent. England considered Spain to be its mortal enemy, partly because Spain was Catholic and England was temporarily Protestant, and Spain had kind of helped that rivalry along with their little invasion attempt. Spain tried to justify their empire building by saying that they were converting the Indians to Catholicism. And England decided that they would justify their empire building by saying, well, we're going to make the Indians Protestant. So not only are they going to free the natives from their own traditions, they're also going to free them from the tyranny of the Pope. And England seized on those reports of Spanish atrocities, like everything that Las Casas had said, that was very popular in England at the time. Those atrocities were not confined to Spain. England had proven itself more than capable of brutality many times over. But the idea that Spain was uniquely murderous and tyrannical gave England an excuse to say that their own empire is going to be about freedom. A Protestant minister wrote to Elizabeth I, listing reasons why she ought to support England establishing colonies, and one of the reasons was that England had a divine mission, he said, to rescue the New World from the influence of tyranny and Catholicism. He wrote that the Indians of the New World were crying out to us to come and help. Now, when the English did establish colonies, they weren't always better than the Spanish. But the English always believed that they were unique, that they were spreading freedom as they understood it. But like we talked about in the first lecture, the way they understood freedom is not the way that Native people understood it, and not the way that we would understand it now. Now, one of the other reasons for colonization, and a big reason, was money. We need to enrich the empire. Spain has already claimed Central and most of South America. France has already stuck their name on the map in the north in what is now Canada. So to England, that left only a smidge of land for them. They had no idea how big North America, the continent, actually was. At this point, England kind of thinks it doesn't stretch much beyond the Appalachian Mountains in, central Georgia. France has a good trading colony. Spain has gold and sugar plantations. But what can England squeeze out of this little strip that's left to them? They can get land, the land itself. A lot of people who supported colonization described what is now the eastern U.S. as this incredibly fertile land, this land of plenty, where the soil was so wonderful and there were so many animals that anyone they sent could eat all they wanted. And they would have enough surplus left to send back to England. They will never run out. And that idea of sending people to take the land so that they can produce a lot of food was very appealing, because England was facing an economic crisis. Between 1550 and 1600, the population in England jumped from 3 million to 4 million people, 1 million extra people in just half a century. Now, there were minor outbreaks of plague during the 1600s that killed a couple 100,000 people, But there were still more people in England than the colony could support, than the economy could support, because the English economy is changing. For generations, peasants, although they had very few rights, they could at least count on having a place, being able to work the land, and as long as there's no famine, having enough to eat. But in the late 1500s, early 1600s, the men who owned that land realized that they could make more money if they didn't grow crops and instead raised sheep. So they start evicting these peasant families, tossing these peasant families out on their ears, fencing in what used to be commonly held land for sheep to graze instead of growing food. Now, a small landlord might have, we'll say 400 acres, and 20 peasant families to work it. But if you fence that in, you let it run to pasture land, you don't need at least half of those families anymore. And if you're real greedy, you can evict 15 of those 20 families and just use the remaining 5 families to keep your 400 acres of sheep. Landlords and merchants benefited from this process, what they call the enclosures. But thousands of peasant families were forced out. They were no longer needed, their work was no longer needed, so they lose their homes. They lose the land that their families have worked for generations. This is in a time when most people never traveled more than 20 miles from home. When maybe 15 towns in the entire country of England had more than 5,000 people. And now these families have to go looking for work all over the country, move to a town and try to earn a trade. And then that hurts the towns too. So not only is the people in the countryside suffering because they've lost this sense of community, they've lost the land that they've lived on, they're no longer growing food to support their families because they don't have access to that land. Now the towns are hurting because there's this massive influx of jobless people going to the towns looking for work. So wages fall, and an employer can take his pick of the most desperate men. Some people started traveling the country looking for work wherever they could find it. Often they were arrested as vagrants, and the situation got worse because of all of the gold flooding into Europe from the New World, so the value of money went down. Now, a man with one gold coin might think himself very rich in 1500, but by 1600, there's gold everywhere. At the end of the 1600s, England conducted a survey, one of the first of its kind, and found that half of all of the people in England lived in poverty. John Winthrop, who will come to the colonies in the New World, wrote, "All our towns complain of the burden of poor people and strive by all means to rid any such as they have." So that's what the colonies can do. They can be a place to ship your poor people. Different rulers in England had different methods of dealing with this crisis. When Henry VIII was in power, he kind of sucked. So he had the unemployed whipped, branded, and the men forced into the army, or just hanged if they wouldn't go into the army. When Elizabeth became queen, there was a law that allowed local judges to regulate wages and working hours, kind of like a primitive minimum wage scheme. But those judges were also allowed to force jobless people to work at whatever job could be found for them. And if they refused that job, that's grounds for punishment. So a lot of people thought that a better solution would be to take these unruly poor folks and ship them off to the New World, where they can be colonists, where they might be able to get some land of their own and might become productive citizens. That idea that the Americas were a place where settlers could escape inequality and make a life for themselves, that was very popular. If there's land available, why not let poor people have some? Having land, owning it on your own, was a symbol of freedom. We talked about those different levels of freedom, those different statuses within the hierarchy of English society. And being a landowner made you a truly independent person. If you worked for wages, then you weren't really independent, they thought, because you depend on your boss to pay you. Only those who control their own labor could be truly free. From the earliest days of settlement, the English viewed the New World as this unique place where even the laboring classes might get some economic independence, where even criminals might get a second chance. When the Jamestown colony, the first permanent English colony, when that was founded in 1607, its leader, John Smith, wrote that in America, every man may be the master and owner of his own labor, which was so important for men to believe themselves free. By 1623, the king himself was promising that any settler could easily become the lord of 200 acres. The crown and the government privately thought of empire building as a way to gain wealth, but they sold the idea to the people by promising land and independence. North America in the 1600s was an unstable and dangerous place. Diseases killed off indigenous folks and European folks alike. Colonies were racked by religious and political and economic tensions. They were drawn into Europe's imperial wars and into conflict with native people. They were dependent on the mother country for protection, for supplies. But between 1607, when the first English colony was founded at Jamestown, the first permanent English colony, between 1607 and 1700, about 500,000 people left England. Most of them didn't come to what is now the United States. About 180,000 of them went to Ireland, and about that same number went to the Caribbean, which can't blame them for that. By 1650, there were way more Englishmen in the Caribbean than in all of North America. But the English population in North America steadily grew. The Chesapeake area, which is today the states of Virginia and Maryland, they are the Chesapeake states, Virginia and Maryland. They got about 120,000 settlers. A lot of these early colonists were young single men. The vast majority in the Chesapeake were young single men, most of them from the bottom rungs of English society. Many of them had already moved from place to place in England looking for work, so colonial settlement for them was their last chance. Now, settlers, colonists who could pay for their own passage, who could pay for the boat ride, they arrived in America as free people. Those would include colonial officials and merchants, members of the lesser nobility. Many of them quickly got land in the New World. But they're only a tiny part, only a small percentage of these early colonists. 2/3 of the English settlers in the 1600s across the board, all 12 colonies that we had in the 1600s, 2/3 of those settlers came as indentured servants. Indentured servants were people who voluntarily gave up their freedom for a specific amount of time, usually 5 to 7 years, in exchange for someone else to pay their passage to America. Now, indentured servants, if they survived the harsh conditions and the often brutal treatment, they would become free once they served those years. And once they were free, they would receive what was called freedom dues, something that they had been promised in their contract. When you're freed, you will get clothing, you will get tools. Sometimes they were promised a bit of land. And then you would become a free member of society. No longer a serf, no longer a peasant, something different. But while they were indentured servants, while they're still working out this contract, they were often treated little better than slaves. They could be bought and sold. They could not marry without their master's permission, and if a female servant became pregnant, her term of service would be lengthened. Physical punishment, whipping, was totally allowed and enforced by the courts. Given the high death rate, many servants, especially in the early days of settlement, the early decades of settlement, didn't live to the end of their terms. The freedom dues that they received were often pretty meager. And advertisements for servants back in England, hey, come to the New World, often painted a much prettier picture of life in the colonies than what it actually was. And a lot of people were not prepared to live and work in the conditions that they actually found. Most of them came hoping that they would receive land in their freedom dues. The promise of that land lured many settlers, and freedom dues that included land persuaded a lot of people who might not have come to sign these contracts as indentured servants. Land was also a way for the king to reward his relatives and his allies, give them a charter, let them start a new colony and kind of govern it how they wanted to. Land was a source of wealth and power for colonial officials and their best friends who built up enormous estates. But without labor, that land won't be profitable. Since colonists didn't come to America intending to work someone else's land forever, the very abundance of the land that was being given away led many property owners to eventually turn to slaves as a workforce. Now, of course, the land in North America already belonged to people. It's already occupied. And the arrival of English settlers presented the native population in the East with a massive crisis. Unlike the French Empire, which had relatively small settlements, the English were immediately intent on displacing native people and taking their land. They don't want to intermarry with Indians. They don't want to organize their labor. They don't want to make them subjects of the English crown. They just want them to go away. Stay close enough to trade. But aside from that, stay away. English communities wanted to be obstinately separate from their Indian neighbors. Now, English authorities, the people in power, insisted that native tribes had no real claim to the land. They have what the English called temporary right of occupancy. Like, they're there right now, but, they don't always have to stay there. And once they're not there anymore, for whatever reason, then, of course, England can claim them. In practice, though, especially in these early few decades, the number of English settlers are so small, and the number of native people is so large, that in practice, the English have to recognize that they should step carefully. So at first, they do try to get land by purchase, or by trade, or by treaty. Some colonial governments tried to keep the peace by stopping private citizens from just seizing Indian land. But new settlers and freed servants want land right now. So the 1600s was marked by recurrent warfare between colonists and Indians. Those conflicts generated a strong feeling of superiority and separateness among the colonists. Their sense of identity as Englishmen, they don't think of themselves as Americans at all. They won't call themselves or think of themselves as Americans until the 1770s. And this is 150 years before that. Their sense of identity as English was heightened by the distance that they kept between themselves and their Indian neighbors. In the early stages of settlement, English colonists would often build their towns on village sites that had already been cleared by Indian tribes. They planted native crops. They adopted Indian technology. But over time, as more Englishmen come, they displace the original inhabitants and they set themselves up as a separate people. Now, many Eastern tribes at first welcomed the English. There are so few of them, they don't seem like a threat at all. And they have interesting stuff. They've got iron axes, and they've got guns, and they've got copper ornaments, and they've got, iron kettles and skillets and things you can cook in, and that's just really kind of cool. So those goods, those European goods, were quickly integrated into Indian life, and we see changes taking place almost immediately within the lives of these tribes that have access to European trade goods, changing how people hunted and farmed and cooked. And men devoted more time to hunting fur so that they could trade for those European goods. Older skills started to deteriorate as more people used European goods. Growing connections with this European trade stimulated warfare between different Indian nations over who's going to control the hunting to get the fur to trade for the cool stuff. And we really by the mid-1600s start seeing massive overhunting of beaver and deer that force people to travel further afield every year to continue hunting for the trade. Merchants and missionaries and colonial officials, they all want to reshape Indian society and culture in a way that will make Native people more amenable to the English. But it was actually the settlers themselves who threatened Indian lifeways more completely than any group of soldiers or bureaucrats. The settlers fenced in the land. The settlers introduced new invasive plants, new livestock, and the natural environment began to change in ways that undermined traditional Indian agriculture and hunting. The English would let their pigs and cattle roam freely, let them trample Indian fields and gardens. The English built their homes from wood and used wood to heat their homes, and that depleted the forests that the Indians had relied on for hunting. In the early days of contact with the English, one group of Powhatan allied people in the Chesapeake said to them, "Since you are strangers here, since you have come into our country, you should conform yourselves to the customs of our country rather than impose yours on us." But it was the Indians whose lives were most powerfully altered by the changes starting in 1607 when English colonists landed at Jamestown. Now, the early settlement at Jamestown was not very promising. Jamestown had problems with leadership, and the colonists suffered an extraordinary death rate. And the Virginia Company, the company that founded this colony, they tried to save money by skimping on supplies, which didn't help the death rate. Most of their first couple boatloads of colonists were not actually there for the land. They weren't really there to settle. Most of them were looking for gold. I mean, the company and the crown had advertised the New World as land, right? You're going there for land. You're going to settle and you're going to make the land profitable. You're going to grow crops on the land. But for some reason, the first couple years of Jamestown settlers had it in their heads that they were going to step off the boat and immediately find gold. That's what the Spanish had done, as far as the English knew, so they thought they would find the same thing. That is a problem for them. They don't want to plant any food. They want to live off of what they had in the boat, which is going to run out quickly. They don't want to build houses. They don't want to even put up a stockade around their tents to defend themselves. They see that as a waste of time. They're going to go off into the hills and they're going to find that gold. And they're going to die in incredible numbers looking for that gold. The placement, the location of Jamestown was also a problem. The Virginia Company specifically told the colony's leaders to find a spot away from any Indian village, as they didn't want to immediately start having problems with native people. So find a spot of land that the Indians aren't using and build your town there. Well, there they did find a spot of land where there weren't any Indian villages nearby. It was in a malaria-infested swamp. Even today, if you go to Jamestown in the summer, that's the worst time. It is unusually sweltering in the summer. And back then it was just as bad. And the settlers dumped their garbage into the river, which they were used to doing that back in England. But in England, the rivers would eventually flow out to the sea, and the James River is in a swamp, so it doesn't flow quickly. So the garbage sits there, and that allows germs to breed, and people get dysentery and typhoid fever. And by the end of the first year, half of those settlers were dead. The next year, they get another boatload of arrivals. By 1608, Jamestown has 400 settlers. But by the winter of 1610, there are only 85 out of 400 left alive. This is called the starving time because they're so focused on gold. They're not really putting in the effort to keep themselves alive and think intelligently about how they're going to do this. They keep thinking, we're going to find that gold and then we're going to hop on the boat and go right back to England. We don't need to worry about what's happening here. And so they die in these ridiculous numbers. And of course, during the starving time, as we very recently, like in the last 3 or 4 years, got evidence of, ended up resorting to cannibalism to survive. By 1616, more than 80% of the immigrants who had come in the last decade had died. Jamestown only held it together by the military discipline of their first leader, John Smith. Smith imposed a regime of forced labor. He said, "He that will not work shall not eat." And by work, he doesn't mean hunting for gold. He means planting crops. He means building the stockade, building the shelters, doing reasonable things to keep yourself alive. The colonists hated him. But even after he was forced to go back to England, colonial leaders realized that he had the right idea, and they followed his example. The company that is financing all of this, the Virginia Company, they slowly realized that their colony would not survive if they have no one there except these dudes hunting for gold. They've got to grow their own food. They've got to find a trade good, something besides gold, which is clearly not going to be found there. They need more real settlers. So the company changed its policies. The Virginia Company introduced the headright system. The headright system. This system gave 50 acres of land to any colonist who could pay for his own passage or for any other person's passage to the New World. So if you're a single man and you pay for yourself, you get off the boat, you get 50 acres. If you bring your wife and 5 kids, you get 50 acres for every person you bring. So the whole family comes over, you step off the boat, here's a deed for 350 acres. If you're the son of a nobleman, if you've got a lot of money, you can bring yourself, you can bring a whole passel of servants, and you get 50 acres for each of them. The company also established the House of Burgesses. Yeah, I know we skipped ahead, don't worry about it. The House of Burgesses was the first elected body in colonial America. Now, the House of Burgesses was not a really good example of democracy as we would think of it today. Only landowners could vote, and the Virginia Company could veto any law that the House of Burgesses passed. But just by creating it, that set a precedent that all the North American colonies would follow. Now, that same year, 1619, the same year that the House of Burgesses was established, the first 20 African slaves arrived in Virginia. Those two events together laid the foundation for a society that will one day be dominated economically and politically by slave-owning large planters. When the English arrived at Jamestown, they landed in a region that already had about 20,000 people living there, 20,000 native people, living in settled farming towns. Most of these villages acknowledged the rule of a man named Wahusonoko, who was the leader of about 30 subordinate tribes. His particular nation was called the Powhatan, and that was his title as the paramount chief of this alliance, of this confederacy. He was the Powhatan. But when the English met him, they got a little confused, and Wahusonoko is a little hard to pronounce for them. Powhatan is easier, so the English wrote his name down as Powhatan. That was actually his title, though. That was not his name. Now, the Powhatan, Wahusonoko, quickly realized that he could get an advantage for his people, for his tribe, and for these 30 allied tribes as well, by trading with these newcomers. So one village after another invited English settlers to come to feasts and entertainments, and the Virginia Company told their colonists to treat the local Indians cooperatively, try to convert them to Protestantism, but don't force them. We don't want to be accused of atrocities like the Spanish were. And John Smith, in particular, was instrumental in trying to get the settlers to deal fairly with the Indians, to stop stealing their crops, all of that stuff. In fact, John Smith was adopted into Wahusonoko's family. You may have heard this story, or you may have seen the Disney cartoon, Pocahontas. Pocahontas was the nickname of Wahusonoko's favorite daughter. Her real name was Matawaka. Pocahontas means mischievous. She was sort of a ornery little girl, playful little girl, and her father just adored her. And so you may have heard this story that the Indians were going to kill John Smith. They were going to smash his head in, and she laid her head over his to defend him. They were never actually going to kill him. That is a ceremony of adoption and alliance. By this little girl putting her head over John Smith's, symbolically defending him. She's showing that he has been accepted by this family, by this powerful family in this region. There was no romance between them. She was 9 years old when they met. That would have been super gross. So this is just an adoption ceremony. There's no love affair, and he was never actually in any danger from the Powhatan Confederation. And for a couple of years, while John Smith and Wahusonoko are in charge of their respective sides, the relationship between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy were mostly peaceful, based on a fairly equal give and take. But when John Smith was forced to return to England, then the tensions started mounting. The new leaders of Jamestown were not as cooperatively minded as John Smith had been. They believed that they were established and they were in a good position to start demanding more and then taking what they wanted. And looking at the numbers, we can see that they were very incorrect about that, but they didn't know about the starving time. They didn't know that was going to happen in the future. They wanted more land. They wanted land out of the swamp. So the Jamestown settlers massacred a Powhatan allied village and tried to take that land for themselves. And the entire Powhatan Confederacy retaliated. The settlers at Jamestown I want to say restored peace, but that's really downplaying what they did. They forced the Powhatan to end the war, or to end this violence, by kidnapping Pocahontas. They kidnapped her. They forced her to marry an English colonist named John Rolfe. And then he took her back to England as a symbol of interracial harmony, even though he took her there by force. She died under mysterious circumstances in 1617. She was maybe 19 or 20 years old at the time. And her father died about a year later. Some people said of grief. Now, John Smith is no longer in Jamestown. Wahusonoko is no longer the Powhatan. His brother, Opechokano, becomes the Powhatan, the leader of this confederacy. Opechokano does not intend to deal with this crap that the Jamestown settlers are bringing to his people. Once it became clear that the English are going to expand, are going to be violent, are going to take, the peace that Smith and Wahusonoko had built came to a screeching halt. In 1622, Opechokano led a brilliantly planned surprise attack that wiped out a quarter of Virginia's settlers in a single day. The surviving colonists retaliated. They burned villages, they killed every Powhatan allied person they could find, and even some people who weren't Powhatan allied. The Virginia Company, the company that was supposed to be in charge of Jamestown, they said that they understood why Opechancanough had led this attack. They said that it's the fear that in time they would lose all of their land. But the colonial governor at Jamestown said that Opechancanough was the one who destroyed the peace. And so he and all of his people had forfeited any claim to their land. And the Virginia Company began a policy of expulsion, pushing them out. As the settlement of Virginia, Jamestown and the surrounding area, as it gets more English settlers, as it builds up, they start to change the balance of power in the region. There are more colonists coming. There are more colonists surviving. And the old leaders of the Powhatan Confederacy, the ones who remembered a time before the English, when all of this land was theirs, they began to die. Opechancanough continued to lead attacks, but he had fewer men every time. And in 1644, Virginia forced a treaty on the surviving coastal Indians. From about 20,000 people when the English first showed up, the Powhatan Confederacy was now down to about 2,000. Those 2,000 had to pledge subordinates to the English government at Jamestown. They also had to move to land that was set aside for them further west, land that was reserved for them. They were no longer allowed to enter areas of European settlement without permission. But the areas of European settlement continued to expand, and soon it included even the reserved land. We can look at these maps. The Powhatan Confederation, these 30-ish villages that included people like the Pamunkey, Rappahannock, a whole lot of different tribes were part of this confederation. They controlled essentially the entire Chesapeake area down here in this pink map. Today, those tribes together have, you can see this little red dot here, and I didn't actually make a yellow dot for the other reservation because that would have made it look bigger than it actually is. But at the tip of where that yellow arrow is pointing, so that red dot and the tip of that yellow arrow, that's what's left for them. Now, the Virginia Company ended up losing power because of this war. The King of England decided that the company was not capable of governing successfully, and so the company was forced to give its charter back to the king. Virginia became then a royal colony. Started as a joint stock colony, which meant that it was governed by a company. Now it's a royal colony. The governor is being appointed by the king himself. But the king is a busy man. You know, there's civil unrest in England. We're getting close to that civil war that they're about to have. So he kind of appoints a governor, grants their requests for supplies, and then mostly ignores them. So the local elite around Jamestown began to control the development of the Virginia colony. And that elite was growing rapidly in wealth and power thanks to the cultivation of a crop introduced from the West Indies, tobacco. Now the king, this would be King James I. The king considered tobacco harmful to the brain and dangerous to the lungs, and wrote up a pamphlet explaining to everybody why they shouldn't use it. His pamphlet was about as useful as the Surgeon General's warning is today. Like, nobody paid attention to him. Europeans believed that tobacco had healthy benefits, even into the 20th century. Some doctors said that tobacco would help asthmatics. It will open up your throat and help you breathe better, they said. Because tobacco is very addictive, the market for it exploded. Jamestown was founded in 1607. Not even 20 years later, they're growing 200,000 pounds of tobacco every year. By the 1660s, they were growing 15 million pounds. By the 1680s, 30 million pounds. The members of the House of Burgesses those landowners. They assigned the good growing land to themselves and their friends. And every time a new tract of land would open up, those members of the House of Burgesses would have the first crack at it. And they become stinking rich. Tobacco farming created a really specific kind of society. Settlers who could get land would establish tobacco plantations, and they would spread out along the rivers. A successful farmer with a lot of land might not have a neighbor by for miles. There were very few towns, and the ones there were mostly on the coasts or the rivers, and they were really just there to gather up the tobacco. There's not a lot of social cohesion because everybody's all spread out. By the middle of the 1600s, a new influx of settlers from wealthy families, sons of merchants, sons of gentlemen, were taking advantage of the headright system and their connections to the House of Burgesses, and were building massive estates for themselves along the rivers. They become the social and political elite of the new colony. But tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. It needs a lot of people to work the fields. And they're, obviously, these wealthy men are not going to plow and harvest for themselves. So there's a huge demand for labor. For most of the 1600s, that demand was met by young male indentured servants. The abundance of land and the fact that they kept opening up more and more tracts, that continued to attract indentures, despite the harsh conditions and the high death rate and laws that allowed them to be whipped for a variety of misdeeds. Of the 120,000 English immigrants who came to the Chesapeake colonies, to Virginia and Maryland during the 1600s, 75% of them came as unfree indentured servants. Virginia's white society was very much like English society. There is a small, wealthy, landed gentry at the top. There's a group of small farmers in the middle, people who don't have much land but have a little bit. And then there's an army of poor laborers at the bottom. By 1700, there were nearly 90,000 Englishmen in Virginia. But they lacked one essential element of English society, of good society. They didn't have family lives. Not a whole lot of women were desperate enough to come to the New World. The colony tried to encourage women to integrate, but the first women they got were women who didn't have any other choice. They brought over boatloads of women, many of them taken out of the prisons in England and brought over and told to marry the settlers, and if you don't, you're going right back into prison. But given the demand for male labor in the tobacco fields, men in the Chesapeake continued to outnumber women by 4 to 1, in some places 5 to 1, throughout the rest of the century. The vast majority of women who came over as unfree people, as indentured servants. And since they had to finish their contract before they could marry, they didn't start to have families until much later than in England itself. So they're in their mid to late 20s, sometimes early 30s, before they start having families. And the high death rate and that unequal ratio between men and women and the late age of marriage meant that families tended to be small. Virginia society was made up of single men, widows, and orphans. The ideal of patriarchy, the ideal of a male-dominated society, that was strong in Virginia because they wanted a society that was set up like England was. But in practice, husbands and fathers really didn't live long enough to control their wives and supervise the lives of their children in the Chesapeake area. And that particular set of conditions, so few women and men dying young, that opened the door for women to have roles in Virginia that they were very rarely able to have in England. Women who came to Virginia and never married kept an independent legal identity and could sometimes get land of their own. widows without children also had some freedoms in Virginia that they wouldn't have had in England. They were able to make contracts, they were able to conduct business. The laws were usually set up the same way that they were in England. People just overlooked them because of practical questions. Now, most women, again, came to Virginia as indentured servants. Most women could really only look forward to a life of hard labor and early death. But for those who survived, there are options that they have in Virginia that they never had before. Now, Virginia is just one of the Chesapeake colonies. The other is Maryland. Maryland follows kind of a similar course of development, but it was founded under very different sponsorship, and it was much smaller than Virginia. Maryland is dominated by tobacco planters, just like Virginia was, but in some ways, it was strikingly different from Virginia. Maryland was established as a proprietary colony. A proprietary colony. That means it was a grant of land that was given to one person. So now we've talked about three different types of colonies. There's the joint stock colony, the way Virginia started, right? Founded by a company. Then it became a royal colony, technically governed by the king. And this proprietary colony of Maryland is governed by one person who has been given this grant by the king. In this case, it was given to a man named Cecilius Calvert. He's the son of one of the king's friends. The charter to start his colony gave Calvert, it said, full, free, and absolute power. He had to have an elected assembly, but all that assembly was allowed to do was either confirm or disapprove of Calvert's laws. It couldn't make laws on its own. Calvert is kind of an old school medieval feudalist. He wants to take all of this land, his land, and divide it up and give it away to people he liked. And then they would all pay him tribute, and they would have peasants to work their fields, and ordinary people would keep their silly little heads out of the business of government and leave it to, the wealthy, privileged men, the way it ought to be. However, the charter that said Calvert had full, free, and absolute power also said that his colonists must have all the privileges and liberties of Englishmen. So when colonists arrive, they believe that the government will operate under a rule of law that applies to everyone. Calvert thinks it does not apply to him. That's a recipe for disaster. And Maryland had more than its fair share of conflict during the 1600s. Another problem was religion. Calvert is Catholic. He wants Maryland to be a haven for Catholics who were being persecuted in England. And the original boatload of colonists in Maryland was mostly Catholic. All of the officials that he appointed to run the government in Maryland were Catholic. Almost all of the good land he gave to Catholics. But the settlers, the majority of settlers, aka indentured servants, were Protestant. They come to be very annoyed, especially after they survive their contracts, after they become technically free people. They get very annoyed that all of the good land is going to this tiny percentage of the population that's not them. The death rate in Maryland is very high, just like Virginia. In Maryland, 70% of male settlers died before the age of 50. Half the children died before the age of 16. But if you were an indentured servant and you lived, you did have a better shot of getting land in Maryland than you did in Virginia. It might not be good land, but at least it would be land. One of the things that Calvert did right, from our perspective, and from the perspective of indentured settlers in his colony, one of the things that he did right was require that if you promised land as freedom dues to your indentured servants, you had to give them that land that you had promised them. Freedom dues included 50 acres of land, and you couldn't just promise it and then not give it to them. If you made that promise, you had to give them that land. That works great for about a generation. But if you've ever looked at a map, you notice that Maryland is kind of small. And as time goes on, and the big tobacco planters monopolize the best land, the chance of an indentured servant getting fertile land diminishes. And eventually, Maryland runs out of land to give. The combination of religious conflict and the fighting over land and sort of general anti-Calvert feelings produced a series of violent outbursts in the mid-1600s. When the English Civil War begins, it will spread to the colonies here, and Maryland is like the North American theater of the English Civil War. In the 1640s, Maryland is on the verge of anarchy. Protestants are on the side of Parliament in the English Civil War, so they plundered Calvert's estate and the estates of his Catholic supporters, people who were on the side of the king. The colonial assembly became dominated by Protestants who are itching to seize land from the big Catholic planters. When Calvert proposed laws, the assembly just automatically rejected them, and then they started to write their own laws, which they're not technically supposed to do. To stabilize this situation, Calvert agreed to appoint a Protestant governor. He also agreed to offer refuge to Protestant dissenters. A Protestant dissenter is anyone who is not a member of the Church of England. Now, the vast majority of Englishmen in this time period were members of the Church of England, but there were smaller churches. There were Puritans, Congregationalists, Anabaptists, in small numbers. And Calvert said, okay, we started Maryland as this haven for Catholics, we will make it a haven for dissenting Protestants as well. And he hoped that that would calm down some of the religious tensions in his colony. In 1649, Maryland adopted an act of religious toleration. It said that all Christians in the colony were guaranteed free exercise of their religion. Now, this law didn't establish religious freedom the way we would understand it, because it defined as Christian only those people who recognize the Trinity. So like Unitarians aren't included. There are other non-Trinitarian sects, and they're not included in this. They're Christian, but they're not recognized as Christian under this law, so they don't get free exercise of their religion. And it was a small Jewish population in Maryland as well, in the city of Baltimore. And of course, it does not protect them. There are Muslims in Maryland, and this law does not protect them. Most of the Muslims at this time would have been slaves, so nobody really cared about their religious freedom anyway. But there were a handful of merchants in the city of Baltimore. But even with the restrictions, even though it doesn't establish the kind of religious freedom that we would want, this law was a milestone in the walk toward religious freedom. Now, one thing that Maryland and Virginia had in common was their use of slaves. Now, England did not start their colonies with the intention of relying on African slave labor, but there is this unstopping demand for workers, which is due in large part to the spread of the tobacco estates. And eventually that led Chesapeake planters to turn to the transatlantic slave trade. Compared with indentured servants, buying slaves offered planters advantages. There were some advantages that were general in owning slaves regardless of race. An indentured servant, if they live out their contract, will have to be freed. But a slave doesn't have a contract, so you don't have to free them. Now, in the early days of American slavery, sometimes they would be freed or could buy their freedom, but eventually even that pathway out of slavery will be closed off. Children of indentured servants are born free. Children of slaves eventually will be born as slaves. And then there were advantages specific to having African slaves. As Africans, they could not claim the rights of Englishmen. Most African slaves were either Muslim, where they practiced a traditional religion, So then the slave owner could claim that he was doing them a favor, using their service to convert them, and that cast a sheen of respectability over what the owner was doing. And in the early days, conversion to Christianity was legal grounds for freeing a slave. And so then the owner could point to his newly freed former slave and say, look at the good I did. Eventually, freedom based on religious conversion will be outlawed, though. Now, Indian slaves, they did have some at the beginning, but they could escape, and they could blend into the surrounding free population, but African people couldn't do that. Eventually, African descent came to be seen as proof of slavery, and any person of African descent was assumed to be a slave unless they could prove otherwise. Africans were also used to intensive agricultural labor. They grew crops that were similar to what Europeans grew. Africa and Europe have been in contact for a long time. African people have been exposed to European diseases, so they died at a less alarming rate than Indian slaves did. The English tended to view all foreigners with some disdain, whether they were native people or African or Irish, and they used similar language to describe all of these people. They called them all pagan and savage and uncivilized. But the idea of race, the idea that humanity is divided into rigidly defined groups according to skin color, that's a modern concept that really hadn't developed yet in the 1600s. The main lines of division in the 1600s were between civilization versus barbarism, or Christianity versus the wrong kind of Christianity. It wasn't really color or race. Anti-black stereotypes developed as a way to excuse slavery. Africans were seen as so different religion, different society, that they were enslavable in a way that poor Englishmen were not. Most English also believed that native people were uncivilized, but the native population declined so quickly, and it was so much easier for them to run away and blend in, that Indian slavery was never viable on the mainland. Many of them were sold into slavery in the Caribbean, but it's difficult to enslave people on their own soil. Slaves are almost always outsiders. Slavery has existed for nearly the entire span of human history. It's central to ancient empires. But slavery in older institutions differed, like we talked about in the first lecture, differed greatly from the institution of slavery that will develop here. In the English colonies, slavery was based on the plantation. It was based on this agricultural unit that brought together a whole bunch of slaves under the control of one owner, usually off in some isolated location. And that imbalance, that having such a large enslaved population, made the owners fear slave rebellions. And because of that fear, they policed the system of slavery in the English colonies much more strictly than it was policed in Africa or even in older empires. The English felt that there had to be a sharp boundary between slavery and freedom so nobody tries to cross it. And labor on slave plantations here was much more demanding than slavery typically was in Africa. It was usually household slavery in Africa. And the death rate among slaves here was significantly higher than it was in Africa. And then in the New World, slavery came to be associated with a particular skin color eventually, and that drew a permanent line between white and black. Unlike in Africa, slaves here who became free always carried with them that visible sign of being considered unequal. In Africa, there was no concept of this group of people has no value besides being slaves, but that concept did eventually come to exist here. A sense of African inferiority made enslavement possible, but prejudice by itself didn't create North American slavery. For that to take root, Chesapeake planters had to believe that importing African slaves was the best way to solve their labor shortage. And from our perspective, it doesn't matter if they were right or wrong about that. What matters is that's what they believed was the best way to get the labor they needed. During the 1600s, shipping slaves from Africa to the New World became a major international business, but only a relative handful were brought to England's mainland colonies. By the 1650s, in Brazil and in the West Indies, huge sugar plantations would be manned by hundreds, sometimes thousands of slaves. But in the mainland English colonies, slavery developed much more slowly. First, slaves cost more than indentured servants. And with the high death rate, that made the cost prohibitive. I mean, why pay twice as much to get a slave for life when they're only probably going to live for 5 years anyway? You can get an indentured servant for half that. They'll probably live as long. If you're lucky, they'll kick it before you have to give them their freedom dues. It was a very different way of thinking. Human life was not particularly valued. But for decades, indentured Englishmen continued to form the backbone of the Chesapeake labor force, and the number of slaves remained relatively small. As late as 1680, the black population in the Chesapeake was only about 4,500. In the Caribbean, it was 76,000. The most important social distinction during the 1600s was not so much between black and white, but between the big planters and everyone that they dominated. And for much of the 1600s, the legal status of Chesapeake slaves was ambiguous, and the line between slavery and freedom was easier to cross than it would become. The first black arrivals to English North America were slaves. Although, just as an aside, the first African in the New World at all was actually an explorer who traveled with Columbus. And the first record of wheat planted in the Americas was planted by an African-born Spanish explorer, or explorer on behalf of Spain. Anyway, in the early days of North American slavery, slaves would sometimes be set free, or could buy their freedom. But racial distinctions were established that came to bar even free people of African descent from fully participating in society. As early as 1620, a year after the first slaves arrived, Virginia passed a law saying that black people couldn't serve in the colonial militia. Why do you think that is? What is the purpose of keeping a strong, healthy young man from helping defend the colony? Well, you may be thinking, probably most of you are thinking, do you want to arm somebody who's got a really big, legitimate grudge against you? But also, if you let a man join the military, if you let a person join the military, you let them wear the uniform, you let them take responsibility for defending whatever this is, then you can't really deny them equal citizenship. Somebody who's willing to lay down their health, lay down their life for Virginia is a Virginian. And Virginia doesn't want to grant that to people of African descent. The government also started punishing sexual relations outside of marriage more severely if it happened between an African and a European than if it happened between two people of the same race. In 1643, Virginia passed a tax that only applied to free African Americans. In both Maryland and Virginia, for most of the 1600s, black people could still sue. They could still testify in court. Some even managed to buy land. Some had indentured servants. A couple even actually owned slaves. Anthony Johnson came to Virginia as a slave in the 1620s, and we're not exactly sure how he became free. But by the 1640s, he owned several hundred acres of good coastal tobacco land and a handful of slaves. He was apparently well respected among his neighbors, built up a really nice-sized plantation, But when he died, the courts decided that because Anthony Johnson was African, he was not a citizen, and therefore his land could be seized rather than given to his children. So the bulk of Johnson's land was taken by the neighbors who had so respected him while he was still alive, and his family was not able to hold on to it. Evidence that African people were being held as slaves for life starts to appear in the 1640s. In lists of property, white servants, indentured servants, are listed by the number of years left in their contract, while black servants had no years listed next to their name. In the 1660s, the laws of Virginia and Maryland began to explicitly refer to slavery. As tobacco planting increased and the demand for labor shot up, the condition of white and black servants began to diverge very sharply. The authorities tried to improve the life expectancy and the status and the lifestyle of English indentured servants so that they could attract more of them. But at the same time, the path to freedom for slaves was increasingly cinched off. A Virginia law in 1662 said that if a child was born to one parent who was free and another who was enslaved, the status of the child would match the status of their mother. That is completely upending all English inheritance laws. Under English law, a child inherits from their father. You inherit your name from your father, inherit your status from your father, inherit your wealth, if you have any, from your father. Except in this one instance. Except if your mother is a slave. This law made it profitable for slave owners to rape their slaves. The children of that rape would be slaves that they don't have to pay for, would be people that they could sell off to make money. In 1667, Virginia said that conversion to Christianity was no longer grounds for freedom, so Christians can now enslave other Christians. And the authorities tried to stop the growth of any free black population by defining all children of interracial relationships as illegitimate, even if their parents were legally married. That punished, usually, the children of white women and black men, but not always. Sometimes it was white men and black women. They also outlawed freeing a slave unless that slave was taken out of the colony. They don't want a free community around. First of all, for slaves to run and hide in. And second, by the late 1600s, white people are starting to justify slavery, slowly, by hinting that perhaps Africans don't know how to be free. That it's like okay to do this to them because they really need guidance. Like they probably can't handle themselves if they didn't have someone telling them what to do. But anytime there's a free community, sending their kids to school, working, living as citizens, it proves that racist argument is a lie. You don't want to be proven a liar. So you make any slave who's been freed be sent away. So they can't be that example. So they can't show that you're lying. But by 1680, even though the black population was still very small, only about 4,500 people, the idea of racial difference was becoming firmly entrenched in the law. And then in the last 20 years of the 1600s, slave labor began to grow very quickly, began to overtake indentured servants. A lot of factors contributed to that. One is the death rate is getting better. People are living longer. So it became more economical to purchase a slave for life because you'd probably get more years out of him. Conditions back in England itself started to improve. The Civil War was over, the economy got better, so there aren't as many people who are desperate to leave England. That dries up your source of indentured servants. There are other colonies opening up in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, so people who want to come to the Americas don't have to come to Virginia and Maryland anymore. And then there was a rebellion of indentured servants, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and that finally persuaded the authorities that a wholesale shift to slavery would be best for them. By 1700, about 10% of Virginia's population was black. By 1750, about half of Virginia's population was black. In 1705, the House of Burgesses enacted an entirely new slave code. They added new laws that embedded the principle of white supremacy. Slaves were, after that, defined as property, completely subject to their owners. They could be bought and sold, they could be leased and fought over in court, they could be inherited. After this new set of codes was passed, white people and black people were tried in separate courts. No person of African descent, even if they were free, was allowed to own a firearm or employ a white servant. Any white person could demand to see the freedom papers of any black person. There's that assumption that any black person must be a slave. Virginia had changed. Virginia started as a society with slaves, where slavery was just one system of labor. But when this code takes effect, Virginia becomes a slave society, where slavery is the center of the economy. So Virginia and Maryland are evolving toward societies dominated by a small aristocracy who are ruling over everyone else. But a very different social order was growing in New England. The New England colonies are the colonies of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. Today, we include Maine and Vermont as New England states, but those were not separate colonies during the colonial period, so it's just those 4 colonies. The early history of New England is intimately connected to a particular religious movement known as Puritanism, which arose in England late in the 1500s. Puritanism started as a group of people who thought that the Protestant Reformation in England hadn't gone far enough. But it became an entire viewpoint on how society should operate. Puritans didn't like the Church of England because they thought it was too Catholic, but they also had serious divisions within their own communities. But all of them believe that the Church of England is corrupt. It is still too much like the Catholic Church. It is still too ritualized. People still pray to saints. Churches were too decorated. Puritans thought they should be plain and encourage contemplation. Puritans believed that elaborate ritual and decoration and the rule that priests could marry was too Catholic. Many Puritans rejected the whole idea of a church hierarchy. They believed that each congregation ought to be independent, that they should choose their own clergy, decide for themselves how they want to worship, rather than having bishops and cardinals and all of that. Those Puritans who want each congregation to stand alone, they were called Congregationalists. Now, all Puritans shared a hatred of the Catholic Church. They all share a pride in England's potential. But they believed that neither the Church of England nor the country of England was living up to its ideals. Puritans believed that religion should be demanding, and that believers should spend their time reading the Bible, listening to sermons by educated ministers. According to one estimate, the average Puritan listened to about 7,000 sermons during their lifetime. In their religious beliefs, Puritans followed the idea of this Protestant minister named John Calvin. Calvin, he is a French-speaking Swiss gentleman, so again, John Calvin is not how his name ought to be pronounced, but it is the English way of pronouncing his name. Calvin taught that the world was divided, all the people in the world are divided between God's elect and the damned. And he taught that God had already decided who belonged to which group. When you're born, you are born either elect or damned, and nothing can change it. Calvin said, no earthly works, No prayer, no offering, no being a really good person would save someone that God had already damned. Now, you say that to somebody in the 21st century, and their response is like, awesome, I can do what I want, right? Because if I go off and do something horrible, but I'm elect, then it doesn't matter, I'm going to go to heaven anyway. And if I go off and do something awful and I'm damned, well, I was damned to begin with, so it's not going to change anything. I'm just going to do what I want. However, that's not the way Puritans thought. Calvin also taught that if you are a sober, respectable, responsible, hardworking, church-going person, that is probably a sign that you are elect. Like God probably made you good because you're one of the elect. And if you're lazy and immoral, it's probably because you're damned. And people want to be seen as the elect. They want to believe that they're going to go to heaven when they die, and they also want their neighbors to believe that they're part of God's elect. So they try so hard to exhibit all these signs of goodness so that they can believe and their neighbors can believe that they are elect. A Puritanism becomes this whole state of mind, this single-minded enthusiasm for pursuing the true faith and the correct way of being, but that alienated a lot of people who had different views. Even other Puritans who simply disagree on small points of doctrine. A group of Puritans, a small group of Puritans, became separatists. They decide that the Church of England and English society in general is just too broken for them to fix. So rather than working inside the church and inside English society and trying to make it better, they're going to separate entirely. They're going to form their own church denomination. They are going to leave England. The Plymouth colonists, the first Thanksgiving colonists, they were separatists. Most Puritans are not. Most of them want to purify the church from the inside. But they're not having much luck in the early 1600s. In the 1620s, 1630s, the King of England doesn't like Puritans. He's very lenient toward Catholics, which they hate. And many Puritans decided that England will just not allow itself to be purified. So it should be abandoned. Puritans also blamed a lot of England's problems on the poor, on those jobless men who were looking for jobs, wandering up and down the roads looking for work. So they want to escape England's religious corruption and social problems. They want to found what one of them calls a city set upon a hill that will shine with righteousness and be this good influence to England and encourage all Englishmen to want to live the same way. When they come to America, they're coming like other immigrants. They're coming for freedom as they understand it. In the Chesapeake, colonists came for economic freedom, right? Thinking that they would be able to have that land. When the Puritans come, especially when the first group, when the separatists come, they come for a kind of religious freedom. They don't come for our kind of religious freedom, though. Puritans want to be able to worship and set up a government according to their religious beliefs. But they do not believe in freedom of religion. Because again, their idea of freedom is not ours. They want to give the citizens of their colony the opportunity to have self-denial, to live in this very strict way. But they do not mean that people should have the freedom to practice religion as those individual people see fit. John Winthrop will become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he explained the Puritans' concept of freedom, their understanding of liberty. He said that there is natural liberty and there is moral liberty. Winthrop said that natural liberty means acting without restraint, making your own choices, doing what you want to do. And that's bad, Winthrop said. Natural liberty, he said, meant that a man has the liberty to do evil. We don't want that. Instead, Winthrop said that a Puritan society would allow moral liberty, the only genuine freedom. He said that moral liberty meant that people would be free only to make good choices. They wouldn't be free to do anything that the Puritan government thought wasn't good. So Puritans feel very justified in putting severe restrictions on speech and religion and a person's moral behavior. This is, in the first lecture we talked about those older ideas of freedom. Puritan liberty meant obeying authority. In this case, obeying the church elders' interpretation of God's authority, and then the Puritan government's authority. To Puritans, freedom meant that God's elect, which they believe they are, had the right to govern society according to their very strict religious beliefs. They did not mean that anyone else could exercise their individual beliefs. Now, the first Puritans to immigrate to America were a group of separatists known as the Pilgrims. So, separatists, they are the ones who believe that the English church and English society are too corrupt to be fixed from the inside. We know these people as the Thanksgiving Pilgrims. They originally actually went to the Netherlands, but the Pilgrims thought the Netherlands was too liberal and corrupt. So then they decided to move to Virginia. Virginia already has an established colony. There are already English settlers, so they can have neighbors. But the boat, the Mayflower, got blown off course, and instead it landed on Cape Cod, in what is now Massachusetts. Before they got off the boat, Pilgrim leaders drew up a document called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact. And all of the adult men agreed that they would elect their government representatives. Those representatives would make the laws, and then all of the people will obey those laws. That is the first written government framework in the English colonies. The Pilgrims got off the boat at a place that they called Plymouth Rock. And the whole area was, the native people who had lived in that area had been devastated by a smallpox epidemic. There was an abandoned Indian village. The fields had been already cleared and made ready to plant before the disease spread. And so the English look around and they're like, they're clearly doing what God wants. God has blessed them by giving them standing houses and fields that are ready to be planted. And oh my God. So they planted English crops in the salty, sandy soil there at Plymouth Rock, which all immediately died. And so the Pilgrims had to raid stockpiles of Indian food and stealing from fishing nets. But pretty soon they were met and were helped along by the local Wampanoag tribe. Now, they couldn't speak Wampanoag, and the Wampanoag couldn't speak English. They got lucky again because another local, a Pawtuxet man named Tisquantum, the English call him Squanto, his name is Tisquantum, he could speak English. He could also speak Spanish. He had been kidnapped and sold into slavery by the Spanish, and so he had learned to speak Spanish and English, and I think he could speak a little French as well. And so he became this interpreter and this go-between for the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. So the native people taught the English where to fish, how to plant American crops like corn, and then during the first harvest that actually worked, the Plymouth settlers invited a couple of representatives from the Wampanoag to help them celebrate their survival, and that's what we call the first Thanksgiving. They did not actually eat turkey, though. They ate popcorn and deer. But these Pilgrims want to establish a society based on their religious principles. They governed by consent of the men, and at first, in the Plymouth colony, a man didn't have to be a church member in order to vote, although eventually they will change that. For the first few years that the Plymouth settlers are there, all of the land they claimed was held in common by the entire community. But then they started breaking it up among the settlers, and we start seeing a hierarchy grow there. But Plymouth survived as a separate and independent colony until 1691, but it was soon overshadowed by the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1629 by a group of Puritan merchants. They're not separatists. They want to form a godly society and govern according to Puritan principles, but they also really want to turn a profit from fishing and the fur trade. So the first year, 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Colony got 5 ships. By 1642, about 20,000 Puritans had arrived in Massachusetts Bay. This is one of those events that we call a Great Migration, and multiple events have this name. But this one that we're talking about, that took place in the mid-1600s, this involves Puritans going to Massachusetts Bay. Oh, in many ways, the settlement of Massachusetts Bay, and the settlement of New England in general, was very different than what we got in other colonies. We've already talked about the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland. In those colonies, the vast majority of settlers were young single men. 75% of them came as indentured servants. But in New England, most of the settlers came as family units. Fewer than a quarter came as servants. And they came for many reasons to Massachusetts Bay. Yes, they want to escape religious persecution, but they also want economic opportunity, and they're generally worried about the future of England. They tend to be older and more prosperous than those immigrants to Virginia and Maryland. The number of men and women was much more equally balanced, and because of the even sex ratio, and because of New England's healthier climate, the population in these colonies grew very quickly, doubled just about every 27 years. Because of that population growth, by the end of the 1600s, the white population in New England was much larger than it was in the Chesapeake or even in the Caribbean. And nearly all of those people were descendants of those who came during that 13-year period of the Great Migration. Now, in the Chesapeake, the imbalance between men and women made it hard to form a fully patriarchal society until the 1700s. But in New England, in these northern colonies, that emerged very quickly. Whatever disagreements Puritans had with other Englishmen, they do share a larger belief in male authority and in a common law that limited women's freedom. Puritans in America carefully copied the family structure of England. They insisted that a stable society rested on the obedience of women and children to the male head of household. And in New England, the father's authority was seen as even more vital because they didn't have large numbers of slaves or servants. So dad has to control the family labor just so everyone can survive. Now, the Puritans believed that women and men were spiritual equals. They believed that until a woman challenged them. Women were allowed to become full church members. All of the ministers were men, but Puritans believed that everyone should be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, and some women were able to take kind of leadership positions. The ideal Puritan marriage was supposed to be based on companionship and affection and partnership. Divorce was legal in the Puritan church. But within the household, the husband's authority legally was absolute. A man's position as the head of household was supposed to be the same as God's position at the head of the church. Judges would sometimes step in to protect wives from extreme physical abuse, but moderate physical correction was considered appropriate for women who acted outside their boundaries. Fathers had power over their children. There was even a law that said a son who disobeyed his father should be put to death. Now, there is no evidence that anyone actually carried that out, but it was a law on the books. Women's lives were defined by their responsibility as wives and mothers. This is the interior of the Arnold House, which is in Rhode Island. It's a late Puritan era house. This is the interior of it. Down in the lower picture, you've got a state-of-the-art colonial era kitchen. It's a very large hearth, so you could actually build multiple fires there at multiple levels of heat, so you could cook different things at once. And then on the right-hand side, you see that little indentation. You've got a little bread oven there, too. So, ladies, your responsibility would be, obviously, tending to the kitchen and making sure that the meals are made. Say you want to make something real simple, something like baked beans. That would be about a 2-day process using this kind of state-of-the-art, technologically advanced 17th century kitchen. So you would have to soak the beans, which you still have to do. You'd soak the beans probably overnight, and then the entire next day you would be simmering them very, very slowly in molasses and the spices if you had them to make them baked beans. And you would hope that by the end of the process, after about 48 hours of dealing with this, you hope that you're still in the mood for baked beans. Kind of makes you grateful for the microwave. And then this upper picture, you may have been thinking it looks like a cradle. It is a cradle, but it's an adult cradle. There are no nursing homes and there are no assisted living facilities. Assisted living, when people got elderly in this society, meant going to live with whichever child or grandchild is still around and willing to take care of you. And if you weren't able to get around and feed and bathe yourself, then they would just, they'd put you in this adult cradle. The daughter-in-law would come and feed you, slide you out a couple times a day to clean you up, and then slide you back in. It's just a very labor-intensive kind of life. The typical New England woman married at 22, which was younger than women typically married in England. She gave birth to an average of 7 children. Because New England was a much healthier environment than the Chesapeake was, more children survived infancy. However, the maternal mortality rate, the number of women who died from pregnancy or childbirth complications, that was about the same no matter where you were. Whether you were in Boston or Richmond, Virginia, or London, about 1 in 7 women died before the age of 40 of pregnancy and childbirth complications. That meant that much of a woman's life was devoted to bearing and raising children, and those responsibilities were often fatal. A Puritan society tried to promote the common good. Puritans don't like excessive individualism. They really don't like a lack of social unity. So it's kind of a good thing that they didn't land in Virginia, because in Virginia everybody was all spread out. That plantation-centered society meant that families had very few near neighbors. But Massachusetts became a society of small towns where everyone can kind of keep an eye on each other, and you were expected to do that. You were expected to call out breaches of behavior. And when a town got too big to really keep an eye on people, then the colonial government would give a grant of land to some new tract to a group of settlers. And those would usually be young unmarried men. And they will go out, survey this new piece of land, subdivide it for each family, take some of it for themselves, and then they can get married. Every family was supposed to get a lot in town for their house and a plot of farmland. And in the early decades, the colonists were pretty good at making sure that everyone had equal access to water and pasture land and all of that. And they would keep some common land, either for the sons of the founders or in case some later settlers came along and needed it. And every town had a church, specifically a Congregationalist Puritan church. And according to the law, every town had to have a school. Puritans believed that everyone should be able to read the Bible, so a school is necessary. To train ministers, they built Harvard College in 1636. And 2 years later, they established the first North American printing press. The principle of consent was central to Puritan government. Each town, each church congregation, and those are kind of interchangeable, right? In every town there is the church, the one church, and the town is that congregation. They each stand alone. There are no bishops, there's no real higher authority. Towns and churches were formed by voluntary agreement among men, who would then elect the minister. And no important church decisions were supposed to be made without the agreement of the male church members. Towns had their own councils, they essentially governed themselves. The colonial governor, the local officials, those are all elected positions. But Puritans didn't believe in equality. Anybody could worship in the church. Well, everybody had to worship in the church. But church membership was restricted. To be a full voting member of the church, you had to demonstrate that you were the elect. You have to be not even just on your best behavior, you've got to be several notches above that, and everyone will watch you. And even once you become a full church member, you can't relax, because now you got to live up to that standard. In the first generation of settlers, the vast majority of men were church members because they're hardcore Puritan believers. So of course they can demonstrate that they're the elect, and so most of the men can vote and hold colonial office. But as time goes on, the younger generations are less interested in religion than their parents, and they often did not become full members of the church. So a smaller and smaller percentage every year is controlling the government. Puritan democracy was only for those within the circle of church membership. If you were outside, you very much had a secondary place. New England in the 1600s was a hierarchical society, but instead of being based on nobility, it was based on church membership. A land distribution at first started out being relatively equal, but within a couple of generations, the prominent church members were somehow getting the best land for themselves. They said that was part of God's plan. The courts in Massachusetts Bay began to forbid ordinary men and women from calling themselves certain things or from dressing in certain ways. If you ever had, a Thanksgiving pageant, or you looked at pictures of the Pilgrims or drawings of the Pilgrims, you probably have this idea in your head of what Puritans look like. That they only wear the black broadcloth, women in dresses, they wear the hats, they maybe have a lace collar, but probably not. That's how you had to dress if you were poor. But you could wear what they called the garb of gentlemen if you were full church members. So Elizabeth Freak, this is a picture of her and her daughter. Her husband was a prominent official in Massachusetts Bay. And you'll notice that she's wearing a lot of colors. She's wearing green and red. She's got this gigantic lace collar on, and her daughter's wearing gold. She's wearing patterned clothing as well instead of just plain colored clothing. That's because she's, the better sort. Her husband's a full church member, and so is she. They're a wealthy, important family. She can call herself mistress. Her husband can call himself master. But if you weren't wealthy, you could only call yourself goodman or goodwife, and you're limited by law in the colors of clothing that you can wear and even the kind of fabric that you can wear. And if you breached that law, if you were a regular everyday person and you tried to wear velvet, they would literally arrest you for it. When the General Court issued a set of laws called the Body of Liberties in 1641, all of those liberties were very hierarchical. It depended on your place in society. There were some liberties that they said everyone could have, but there were separate lists for free men, for free women, for children, for servants, and also for slaves. Now, church and state are very interconnected in Massachusetts. Every town was required to have a congregationalist church. That's the only church they could have. Every townsperson was taxed to pay the minister. and the government enforced religious laws. You could get the death penalty for blasphemy. But Puritans said they believed in individual judgment, hence their insistence on reading the Bible. The first item that was printed in English North America was this broadside that explained the rights and duties of citizens of Massachusetts and said that men should vote their own judgment. But our modern ideas of privacy and individualism and personal freedom would have seemed very strange to Puritans. In New England towns, residents carefully monitored each other's behavior, and they punished or banished people who violated those norms. One Puritan minister said that dissenters, criticizers, have liberty. They have the liberty to keep away from us. People were banished for criticizing the church leaders or the government or complaining about the colony in letters back home. One woman, Abigail Gifford, was banished for being a very burdensome woman, the court documents said. But exactly what she did to be burdensome, we're not really sure. But we can tell that tolerance is not high on the list of Puritan virtues. But from the moment these colonies were founded, some folks had their own ideas, their own individual thoughts about how it should be run. Now, Puritans kind of set themselves up for this with their insisting that everyone should be able to read and interpret the Bible. Because if you let somebody read for themselves, you give them a measure of freedom. You let them have this mental life that can't be controlled. The first major criticism of the Puritan government came from a Puritan minister, a young man named Roger Williams. And from the time he stepped off the boat in Massachusetts, Williams insisted that everything needed to be completely changed. Puritan churches need to withdraw from the Church of England. Church and state should be totally separate. Williams said that moral law, church law, should not be enforced by the civil government, that people should be able to follow their conscience where it leads. He said that any law-abiding citizen should be free to practice whatever religion they liked. He said that genuine faith can't be coerced. You can't force a person into really believing. All you can do is force them into pretending that they believe, and that's useless. And Williams said that the Puritans were not God's elect. He is a Puritan. He is a Puritan minister. But he said that God didn't have any particular favorite people. There's no group of people who can say that they're God's elect. And then he said that this land that's being settled by Englishmen does not belong to England. That the king did not have the right to give that land away. This not only flies in the face of that English idea of their own superiority, it is actually a threat. It's something that could cause them real problems. The kings of England at this time, they want to be absolute rulers. They don't appreciate being challenged in any way. And now they've got this minister over in Massachusetts saying the king has overstepped his bounds. That's really the biggest problem that the Puritan leadership had with Roger Williams. They can tolerate some of his ridiculous religious ideas from their point of view. But when he starts challenging the king, then he's kind of putting them in a dangerous position. So Williams and his followers were banished. They were forced to leave the colony of Massachusetts Bay in 1636. So they leave, they go off, and they establish their own colony, a separate one. They establish the colony of Rhode Island. And eventually, Roger Williams broke down and asked the King of England for a charter to form the government. The king that he said didn't have the right to give that land away. Rhode Island became a beacon of religious freedom. And this time, it's really in the modern sense of that phrase. Rhode Island didn't have an established church. You didn't have to be a church member to vote until after Roger Williams was dead. You didn't have to go to church at all if you didn't want to. But you could be Puritan, or you could be Church of England or Quaker. You could be Catholic, you could be Jewish. You could just not care in any way, shape, or form, and Rhode Island wouldn't punish you for it. The Rhode Island Colonial Assembly was elected every 6 months. So you elect somebody, they do a crappy job, you can get rid of them pretty quickly. They elected a new governor every year. Town meetings were held every month. Now, other colonies were founded by religious dissent as well. The same year that Roger Williams was banished, a Puritan minister named Thomas Hooker started a colony at Hartford in what is now Connecticut because he also wanted non-church members to be able to vote. The colony at New Haven, Connecticut, was established by dissenters who thought that Massachusetts Bay wasn't strict enough. So I'll let you sit with that horrible thought in your head. But the most threatening dissenter to the Puritan establishment was Anne Hutchinson. She was a midwife, the daughter of a minister, so she has a position of authority. She has a position of respect. She started holding meetings in her home. She led religious discussions. They'd go to church, listen to the sermon, then everybody would gather back at Anne's house and they would talk about it, what they agreed with and what they disagreed with. And soon her friends and followers included a number of important merchants, some public officials, and Hutchinson started talking about what she thought. Hutchinson believed that salvation can't be earned. That part should have been okay. That is a Puritan belief. You know, good works will not earn you salvation. What made Hutchinson a problem is, first of all, that she's a woman saying this. And also, she's starting to challenge some of the ministers in Massachusetts. There's a group of ministers in this colony who are claiming that they can tell who is elect and who is not. They know who's elect and who's damned because the elect behave correctly, go to church, and make nice big donations to the churches and to the ministers who are deciding who is elect and who is not. And those who are damned are not. And Hutchinson said, you can't know the condition of another person's soul. Now, on the face of it, that is a perfectly normal Puritan belief for Anne Hutchinson to have. But she's inviting trouble by calling out these powerful ministers. And the ministers are doing things that they're not supposed to do, but she is calling them out. The ministers are not going to tolerate this challenge, especially from a chick. And church and government were so intertwined that the colonial leadership couldn't let it go either. In 1637, Anne Hutchinson was put on trial for sedition, for expressing opinions that were dangerous to authority. She was condemned both for what she was saying and because she's a woman who's saying it, telling men what she thought and expecting them to listen. Hutchinson and most of her followers were banished. They went to Rhode Island first. Roger Williams took them in. And then they went further south to Long Island, where she and most of her family died during an Indian War. Well, Anne Hutchinson only lived in New England for about 8 years, but she left her mark on the religious culture of the region. Just like Roger Williams, Hutchinson showed that the Puritan belief in individual judgment can easily turn into criticism of the church and the government. A number of her followers who survived the Indian War became Quakers. The Quaker Church is also known as the Religious Society of Friends. They believed, they're a Protestant Christian denomination. They believed that the Spirit of God is within each individual person, not just the elect. And they believe that it's that inner light, what they call the still small voice inside, that ought to guide people. That people should listen to the voice of God inside themselves and not to ministers who are saying they know who's elect and who's damned. Then these Quakers go back to Massachusetts, and the colonial officials have them whipped and fined and banished again. In 1659 and 1660, a number of Quakers who tried to come back again into the colony were just hanged. That treatment of Quakers gave Massachusetts a reputation as a nasty place of persecution. When the English monarchy was restored after the Civil War, one of the first things the new king did was order Massachusetts to recognize liberty of conscience for all Protestants. So the Puritans mostly stopped hanging, but they continued to persecute Quakers and also Baptists and basically everybody else. It took a long time for religious toleration to come to Massachusetts. Along with their internal religious issues, New England had to deal with the difficult problem of Indian relations. There were probably 100,000 native people in the New England region when the Puritans arrived. But because of epidemics, because of illness, the Puritans didn't encounter a huge number of Indians when they settled along the coast. Many native people had fled inland to escape the disease. So where the English settled at first, they outnumbered the local native population. Now, some settlers, like Roger Williams, said that Indians ought to be treated fairly. They ought to be treated as men. He said that this land already belonged to people and the king had no right to just up and give it away. Williams believed that the land should be bought for a fair price. Now, most of the other Puritan officials do not believe that. Like John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts Bay, said that any uncultivated land, unfarmed land, was free for the taking. And if the settlers gave anything to the Indians in exchange for that land, then the Indians must be forced to submit to English authority and pay tribute to the English settlers. To the New England colonists, native people were scary but also tempting. They have freedom, but they have the wrong kind of freedom. They have that natural liberty that John Winthrop had condemned. Puritan leaders were afraid that colonists who lacked the proper moral fiber might get tired of living under all the Puritan rules, so they would go off and live with Indians, and so they passed very harsh laws against English settlers who escaped to live with an Indian settlement. Puritans often said that they wanted to convert the Indians, but really they acted like native people were an obstacle to be pushed aside, rather than potential neighbors and converts. The nations in New England didn't have a paramount chief like the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia. And so each tribe has to decide for itself what tactics they're going to take with the English. Most of the coastal Indian tribes at first tried to make alliances with the English to strengthen themselves against their traditional rivals. But as the English population expanded and new towns spring up and more land is being taken, conflict becomes unavoidable. The turning point came in 1637 when several Connecticut settlers were out surveying in preparation to take some land that they weren't supposed to be on. And they were killed by some Pequot warriors. The Pequots were a powerful tribe who essentially controlled the fur trade in New England and were powerful enough that they received tribute from several other nations. Well, Connecticut and Massachusetts militias joined together with some of the Pequots' native enemies, like the Narragansett and the Mohegan, and they surrounded the main Pequot village on the Mystic River and set fire to it. And anyone who tried to escape the fire was shot and bayoneted by the English soldiers. More than 500, mostly women and children, were killed in the Mystic Massacre here. By the end of the Pequot War, a few months later, most of the Pequots had been sold into slavery in the Caribbean or had just been killed. The treaty that ended the Pequot War said that the Pequot name should be wiped from the historical record and never to be spoken again, which is one reason why I like talking about the Pequot War, because it would really annoy some old Puritan. The Pequot had been one of the most powerful groups in this region. When they were destroyed, that didn't just open up Connecticut for white settlement. It also created this power vacuum among The other tribes. Who's going to step in and take this position now? Who's going to be the tribe that controls the fur trade? Most of these tribes, having either witnessed the Mystic Massacre or hearing about it, decided that the best way to gain power would be to ally with the English and not resist them. The leaders of the New England colonies prided themselves that religion was their reason for immigration. But economic motives were important too. One pamphlet from the 1620s trying to encourage people to come over said that New England was a place where religion and profit can jump together. Most Puritans came from a part of England called East Anglia. This is the big cloth-producing region of England. It had been one of the most economically advanced regions of England, but in the 1620s and 1630s, it started to suffer from a series of poor harvests and a decline in the cloth industry. And so many of the people who came to New England from that area were flax farmers, weavers, tailors. They're people who have crafting skills, industrial skills. Even though their homeland is starting to hurt economically, they're still relatively well off, compared to the settlers in the Chesapeake, who are mostly servants. Most New Englanders came from kind of the middle ranks of English society. The vast majority could afford to pay for their whole family's passage here, rather than indenturing themselves. They wanted secure land ownership. They wanted a good market for their crafts. When one preacher said in a sermon that the main goal of settlement was to honor God, a man in the congregation corrected him. He said, "Sir, you're mistaken. My main goal was to catch fish." But Puritans didn't see a conflict between religion and profit. Economic success was seen as a sign of God's favor. And New England didn't have sugar and it didn't have tobacco, so its people turned to fishing and timber exports. But the economy was mostly centered on small family farms. They produced enough food for the family and maybe a little surplus for the market. Now, even though there were laws that allowed for slavery, there were very few actual slaves in New England in the 1600s, and indentured servants were fairly rare as well. Most homes used family labor, with women and girls working in the home, men and boys in the field, except at the harvest time when everybody was in the field. Sons waited to marry until their mid-20s, when they were usually given land by their fathers or given land by the town, or they could join with other young men and start a new town. And that desire for land among young men who want to start families, that was a major motivator for New England's expansion. Per capita wealth is the amount of money total divided by the number of citizens. So per capita wealth was smaller in New England than in the Chesapeake, but it was much more evenly distributed. Now, the Chesapeake is a world of a few very wealthy large planters and then everybody else. But in New England, a majority of their families had their own land, had economic independence. There was social inequality. Those who came as indentured servants, those few, rarely became full church members, usually didn't get much land. Most of them became non-voting wage earners. But the vast majority of New Englanders had their own family farms. They were independent people. And New England became an asset to the British Empire through trade. By the end of the 1600s, New England merchants were responsible for shipping the products of other colonies, like fish and agricultural produce, tobacco and rice. And especially in Boston, a powerful class of merchants grew that will become a challenge to the old Puritan establishment. Boston merchants will come to exercise a huge influence in public affairs. The government of the colony promoted economic development, built roads and bridges, and offered bounties to new businesses. Eventually, what had started as this Puritan religious experiment will evolve into a merchant-dominated colonial government. And it'll be that merchant class of Boston that will push along the American Revolution in the 1700s. So by the middle of the 1600s, several English colonies already exist along the Atlantic coast. They have all been founded by different groups for slightly different reasons. They differ in social structure and religion and government. The Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, they're developing into a slavery-based plantation society. The New England colonies, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Rhode Island, Connecticut, they're a land of merchants and family farms. The next 100 years will be a time of crisis as the population expands and the social conflicts intensify, and Britain begins to expand its control over these colonies. Now, there are a lot of conflicts and crises that go along with European expansion in the 1600s. There are social and political tensions that boil over in a series of sometimes brutal conflicts between rich and poor, free and slave, settler and Indian, members of different religious groups. At the same time, struggles between European empires will affect the colonies. Each conflict has its own local cause, but taken together, they add up to a general crisis of colonial society in North America. The European powers want to expand. The Spanish become much stronger in Florida and the Southwest. The northern edges of Spanish America stayed mostly small outposts. New France and New Netherland start to grow. And we're going to look at New Netherlands first. On the map, it's the stuff that's here in the blue. 2 years after Jamestown was founded, the Netherlands claimed an area around what is today New York Harbor. They built trading outposts along the Hudson River. It took them a decade and a half to really start settling colonists on Manhattan Island. In the 1600s, the Netherlands, the Dutch, were becoming a world power. But their North American colonies were not a huge part of that. The Dutch were very important bankers. They dominated international commerce. They're a very small country. There were only 2 million people in the Netherlands. But they established very lucrative, long-lasting colonies in Asia, in South Africa, and lesser colonies here in the New World. The Dutch are like the English. They believe that their nation is unique and especially devoted to the idea of liberty. And the Dutch did have a couple of freedoms that the English did not have in the 1600s. The Dutch had a free press, and they had fairly broad religious toleration. The Netherlands, back in Europe, that country was a haven for all sorts of Protestants who were fleeing persecution and Jewish people who were fleeing persecution. And they had commercial treaties, trading treaties with the North African city-states there. So Muslim traders and sea captains were often in Dutch cities. And the Netherlands was a very prosperous nation. During the 1600s, about 500,000 people immigrated into that country to take advantage of their strong economy and their freedoms. And when the Dutch come to North America, they come mostly to trade, not to conquer. They are less interested in settling the land than in finding a way to make money. And the Dutch, like the English, have that old legend of Spain and its atrocities in the back of their minds. And the Dutch government was determined to treat native people better than the Spanish had. There were a lot of Dutch people who actually identified with native people because they themselves had fought a long, bloody war to get their independence from Spain. So at first, Dutch colonial officials showed no real interest in displacing or converting or otherwise being bothersome to the Indians that they came in contact with. From the beginning, Dutch authorities recognized native sovereignty over the land. They would not allow colonists to settle anywhere until the land had been, from their perspective, fairly purchased from the Indians. Some of you may have heard the story of how the Dutch got Manhattan Island. It's been kind of garbled in the telling over the years. The story that I was told when I was in school was that Dutch officials gave a group of Indians $27 worth of beads, and then the Dutch took Manhattan Island. And that was it. And the Indians were willing to give all that land up for just less than $30 worth of beads. That's not the whole story. That's what the Dutch thought they were doing. But again, we talked about in the first lecture that disconnect, that differences in understanding whether land could even be owned and how you go about doing that and what the land's for. And the Dutch think that they're acting in a fair way. But what they think they're doing is not what their native trading partners think they're doing. See, the people that received, the native people who received those beads, didn't actually live on Manhattan Island. They were allowed to hunt there. They had an alliance with the people who did live on Manhattan Island, and they were allowed to hunt. So when this group of people accepted this trade from the Dutch, what they thought they were doing was making an alliance that would allow the Dutch to also hunt there. It would never have occurred to them that in accepting whatever the trade goods were, that they would have to leave and never come back. It certainly wouldn't have occurred to them that because they accepted these trade goods, some other group of people would also have to leave and never come back. Excuse me. So the Dutch try, as they understand it, they try to be fair as they understand it, but the disconnect is just so huge, and they don't try to bridge that understanding gap. The Dutch did require any nation that they did trading business with to pay tribute to the Dutch colonial authorities. And they do sometimes have conflict with the Indians. In the 1640s, the Dutch had a really greedy governor of their colony, New Netherlands here, who just started snatching land away from the Algonquin, and that sparked a 3-year war that killed 1,200 people. That's actually the war where Anne Hutchinson and her family were killed. The Dutch had to step much more carefully around the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois are the major power in the region, and the Dutch don't want to mess with them. The Dutch have this reputation for loving freedom, but their colony here, the New Netherlands, based around the city of New Amsterdam, was not a democracy. New Amsterdam was the only major city. You might be able to tell from the map that New Amsterdam will become New York City. New Amsterdam was essentially just a fort that was controlled by the Dutch East India Trading Company. They had no elected assembly. But in some ways, Dutch colonists here have more liberty than their English counterparts. Even the slaves of the Dutch had some rights. The Dutch dominated the Atlantic slave trade in the early part of the 1600s, and of course they brought slaves to their colony. But slaves who were owned by the company had what they called half freedom. They were required to work for the company when asked to, but they were also given land to support their families. And when they weren't working for the company, they could work for wages, earn money of their own, and buy their freedom. Slaves who were not owned by the company mostly worked on family farms or in households or in craft shops and learned a trade. And there wasn't this society of large plantations. Dutch women in this settlement had much more independence than in English colonies. According to Dutch law, married women kept their own separate legal identity. They could go to court, they could borrow money, they could own property. Dutch men were used to sharing property with their wives, and their wills generally left part of their estate to their daughters as well as to their sons. But probably the most striking difference between New Amsterdam and the English colonies was the religious freedom. Because of that freedom, New Netherlands attracted a much more diverse group of settlers in the Chesapeake or Massachusetts. By the 1630s, New Amsterdam was home to people from Africa, free people from Africa, and Belgium and France and Ireland and Germany and Scandinavia. Some English Puritans even started leaving their colonies and moving to Long Island to take advantage of the slightly freer atmosphere there. The company that governed New Amsterdam promised its settlers religious toleration and also free land after 6 years of labor. Eventually, they allowed just any settler to get involved in the fur trade as well. In 1629, the company adopted a plan called Freedoms and Exemptions that offered entire estates to anyone who could bring agricultural workers, farm workers, over. Now, that estate owner would have to make an agreement with the Indians to have that land. But aside from that, he could operate his estate however he wanted. He could demand tribute from his workers. He could oversee law enforcement on his land. Despite the advantages of immigrating to New Netherlands, it was never very large under Dutch control. At its height, it had maybe 9,000 settlers in the entire region. And eventually, of course, it would be taken over by the English. You see this canal? Yeah, it's good in here. This canal here, it was called the Common Ditch when the Dutch governed it. When the English took over, this is a picture of people along the Common Ditch while the Dutch were still in control of New Amsterdam. When the English take over, though, they're going to fill in that canal and they're going to pave it over. And today, if you visit New York City, you can walk along the Common Ditch, which is now called Bond Street. Now, the French are also expanding. New France claims a lot more land than New Netherlands does. But in the 1600s, they also have trouble attracting long-term settlers. France established the city of Quebec, right up there, in 1608, so a year after Jamestown. And within 70-some years, France, on the map, had claimed the entire St. Lawrence River Valley, claiming down to the Great Lakes. They will eventually form this, New France will eventually form this gigantic arc that includes the Ohio River and the Mississippi River and kind of tries to pin English settlements to the Atlantic coast. But that's just on the map. In reality, France never has enough people in their colonies to hold onto that land very well. Like a lot of the other colonies we've talked about, New France started out being run by a company. Until 1663, the Company of New France ran this colony, appointed the governor. There's no representative assembly, there's no elected body. The company granted land along the St. Lawrence River to well-connected noblemen who could afford to bring farm workers to the New World. And the company fully expected that those wealthy men would gobble up the best land first, and that the farm workers they bring will form a new peasant class. But most of the workers got here as indentured servants. They saw that there were hardly any women aside from nuns, and as soon as their indenture contracts were over, they went back to France. So during the entire 1600s, New France gets about 12,000 single men to stay on a permanent basis, and only about 250 families. New France got more immigrants than the Dutch colony, but at its height during the 1600s, had maybe 19,000 people total. That is much smaller than what the English were fielding. The workers who went back to France after their contracts were up, they didn't really encourage anybody else to go. They said Canada was an icebox, it's a dumping ground for criminals. So when the French did leave home, they much preferred to go to the Caribbean. New France, because their population is so small, they don't, for most of the 1600s, have an effective militia. So they really depend on keeping a friendly relationship with their native trading partners. The French are kind of like the Dutch. They are both very smug, about how well they cooperate with native people, as opposed to the Spanish or the English. The French worked out a series of alliances with their native trading partners. On the map, they claimed all of this land. But in reality, they didn't take over huge amounts of land the way the English did. They never sent the army in to conquer people and force them to labor like the Spanish did. They did send priests, and French priests will have some success in finding converts. But unlike Spanish missionaries in Mexico, the French allowed Christian Indians, their converts, to keep a high level of independence, and usually didn't try to get rid of all the old ways. We won't see massive forced assimilation in this region until England takes it over. But even with their cooperation, the French did bring a lot of changes to the lives of native people that they had contact with. Of course, there was the immediate spread of disease. And then when different tribes start to participate in what is becoming an international fur trade, they get drawn into international alliances and problems. And these tribes very quickly have to learn to deal with rivalries between European empires. And this hits some of them very hard, in particular the Huron nation. We have some folks who were part of the Huron nation here in Oklahoma today. We call them the Wyandot. The Huron nation originally lived in the Great Lakes area, and they made a trade alliance with the French in the very early 1600s. Many Huron became Catholic, but by the 1640s they had almost been destroyed, first by a smallpox epidemic, and then by attacks from France's rivals, the Dutch. And the Iroquois, who are allied with the Dutch and tend to pick on the Huron anyway. There is a traditional rivalry between the Huron and the Iroquois Confederacy. But a lot of the violence is happening because of this rivalry between France and the Netherlands. France was similar to Spain in one way. Their North American empire also has a lot of intermixing and cultural exchange going on. In the Great Lakes regions, native people and white people lived in relative equality for many years, and the children of marriages between native women and French merchants had a place in French colonial society. They worked as guides and interpreters, or as merchants inheriting their father's businesses. Unlike the English, the French were much more willing to accept native people as a part of their colonial society. They would prefer if native people would speak French and adopt French gender roles and convert to Catholicism and wear European-style clothing. It's a lot more common to see the other thing happening, though, to see French settlers marrying into an Indian nation and adopting their ways. And France doesn't really do anything to stop that. As the New World becomes a battleground in Europe's constant struggles over wealth and power, England began to try and seize more control over the Atlantic trade, and have more control over its empire in general. By the mid-1600s, England had realized that its colonies could be a major source of wealth for the mother country if they're handled properly. There's an economic theory that's very popular at this time, very popular in Western Europe. It's called mercantilism. Mercantilism said that the government should regulate the economy as a way to build up national power, but not regulate necessarily in the way that we do today. Really, really heavy-handed regulation is the basis of mercantilism. Mercantilism said that the government should encourage manufacturing and commerce by giving special consideration to businessmen in the home country. Above all, mercantilism said that trade must be controlled so that more gold is coming into the country than going out of the country. It's basically the way we're all supposed to handle our bank accounts, right? Bring more in than you send out. The way to do this as a country is to make sure that you export, that you sell more goods to other countries than you import or buy from other countries. So if you're England and you import $100 in French silk every year, but you export $200 in English colonial sugar, then you win. You have a good balance of trade. Colonies have a specific place in the mercantilist system, and it is not a place that most colonists like. Under mercantilism, colonies should not be developed. They should not have industry. Colonies are there to provide raw materials to the mother country. Businesses and industries in the mother country, in England itself, will process those materials into finished products, into manufactured goods, and then those businesses in England itself will sell those goods and get the profit. The colonies are only there to provide the raw materials and then buy the finished products. And that severely limits the economic development of the colonies themselves. The English Parliament passed a series of navigation acts. They're economic laws. The navigation acts were meant to strengthen England's trading position and help them build wealth. According to the navigation acts, the most valuable raw materials produced in the colonies, like sugar and tobacco, could be transported to Europe only in English ships, sold only in English ports. They can't be sold directly to the French or the Spanish or the Dutch. So if you are a Virginia tobacco planter, you have to pay to take your tobacco to port and sell it to an authorized agent of the British Empire. You cannot sell your tobacco directly to some guy in Spanish Florida. So you've got to take it to port, you've got to sell it to this particular agent, then that agent who has bought it, he can take it to Florida, he can sell it for the going rate, but you, Mr. Virginia planter, cannot ship your tobacco directly to Florida and sell it, even though you would make more money doing it that way. You also, Mr. Virginia planter, cannot go out and buy French silk directly from a French merchant. You have to buy that silk from an English merchant and pay an import duty on it, an extra tax. So that makes luxury items extremely expensive. And the planters in the Chesapeake are all trying to set themselves up like little lords with all of their luxuries, so they're very quickly going to go into debt. Most of the profits are not going to flow to colonists. Most of the profits of trade is going to flow to English merchants and manufacturers. That's going to annoy a butt ton of people in the colonies. We've got to build some more colonies too. We've hit about 1660, right? 1660 is when that no king period comes to an end. The Commonwealth period ends. They've gone 11 years without a king. England decides that sucked. We're going to go back to the old monarchy way of doing things. So they invite the son of the king that they had killed to come back and take the throne. This will be King Charles II. Charles II is mostly known today as a patron of the arts and just kind of being a party king. But he was actually very interested in expanding the colonial power of England. And within about a generation, the number of colonies in English America doubled. The first that he got was New Netherlands. The Dutch have spread themselves a little thin. They've got colonies all over the world. They don't have a big enough navy to protect all of those colonies. So when England and the Netherlands got into a spat, the Netherlands gave up their North American colony. And the king gave New Amsterdam and the colony of New Netherlands to his younger brother, James, the Duke of York. So New Netherlands became New York. James was granted full and absolute power to govern New York as he wanted. And he wasn't terrible at it. His rule transformed a minor military base into an important imperial outpost. It was a seaport that traded with the Caribbean and with Europe and was a great launch pad for military operations against the French. And in about 20 years, the population of New York more than doubled. When the Dutch surrendered their control of this territory, they did make the English guarantee a couple of things for those Dutch citizens who wanted to stay. They made the English guarantee religious freedom and protection of property rights for those Dutch settlers who were going to stay. But they did not make any guarantee for women's rights. There were many female merchants in New Amsterdam. A lot of them were widows who had inherited their husband's business. But when the English take over, only a handful remain. The English also had stricter laws regarding people of African descent. In colonial New York City, in English colonial New York City, free African Americans were only allowed to work at unskilled jobs and be servants. So if they had worked for craftsmen before and had learned to become, master carpenters or master coopers, they can't do that anymore. They are limited only to unskilled jobs. Now, if you were buddies with the Duke of York, though, if you're James's friend, you will benefit enormously from his rule. He gave immense grants of land to his favorite people. He gave 90,000 acres to Frederick Phillips, 160,000 acres to Robert Livingston. By 1700, nearly 2 million acres were controlled by members of just 5 families. They intermarried all the time to keep the land in their families' hands, and they had a really grotesque amount of political influence. English rule also strengthened the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois had been allied with the Dutch. The Dutch are gone, but the Iroquois are practical. The English are here, and they will ally with the English. The Iroquois agreed that they would help clear other nations off land that England wanted, and they will also help the English in their fight against the French. The English agreed to recognize Iroquois land claims all the way out to the Ohio River Valley, which was not actually Iroquois land. That land was lived on by nations like the Miami Nation and the Ottawa and the Shawnee and those poor Wyandots who have already fled once. In the 1680s, those nations are going to get very tired of the Iroquois Confederacy trying to take from them. And they will band together with the French, and they will all push the Iroquois back east. And so then the Iroquois will decide to be kind of neutral, try to play England and France against each other for a while. They get really good at that. Many of the colonists in New York, though, began to complain that James was not respecting the rights of Englishmen. When the Dutch were there, they had not allowed an elected assembly. James will not allow an elected assembly. There's a lot of grumbling, especially from the colonists on Long Island, which had been settled by a lot of Puritans, and they're used to self-government. So finally, James agreed to call up an assembly, and the assembly got to work, and they wrote up a charter of liberties and privileges. And that charter said, we will hold elections every 3 years. Male landowners are allowed to vote. That charter reaffirmed the traditional rights of Englishmen, trial by jury and security of property. And the charter also protected religious toleration for Protestants. In 1663, Charles II gave 8 of his friends, 8 proprietors, the right to form a colony in the South, to the north of Spanish Florida. We're afraid that the Spanish are going to expand, that they might put some pressure on Virginia, so we're going to create this new colony in between. The first settlers didn't actually arrive in Carolina until 1670. And when they did, they made Carolina it's a colony of a colony. And most of the early settlers didn't come from England, they came from other colonies. Particularly, it started as an offshoot of the English colony on Barbados. Barbados is a little island in the Caribbean, beautiful little place. In the 1600s, Barbados was the richest plantation economy in the Caribbean. It's a sugar economy. But Barbados is a small island, and a couple of generations have gone by, and the land has all been given away. So wealthy planters decided to send their younger sons, who are not going to inherit, to this new place in the Carolinas. And at first, the settlers gave weapons to friendly Indians, and together they raided Spanish Florida. But in 1715, the Creek and the Yamasee became, frankly, alarmed by how aggressive these settlers were becoming, and they tried to push back, and then the colonists ended up pushing them further west. The proprietors of the Carolina colony originally wrote up a constitution that established a feudal society with hereditary nobility and serfs and slaves. And then they advertised for people to come and be serfs, and shockingly didn't attract many people. So then they changed their constitution, and they allowed for an elected assembly and some religious toleration. They also instituted a very generous headright system. They gave 150 acres for each member of an arriving family, and 100 acres to male indentured servants once they'd completed their term. Now, the Carolinas eventually split into North and South, became an extremely hierarchical society, but not through this nobility, serfs, etc. Slavery became the foundation of their society. Slave owners were promised absolute power and authority over their human property. And slaves were included in the headright system, so when you bought a slave, you didn't just get that person's labor, they also gave you 150 acres. That allowed new planters from Barbados, who have wealthy fathers and huge numbers of slaves, to instantly get vast landholdings. Unlike Virginia and Maryland, Carolina was a slave society from the very beginning. And when African slaves introduced rice cultivation, Carolina really took off, and their planters became the wealthiest elite in English North America. The last English colony to be established in the 1600s was Pennsylvania. It's another proprietary colony founded by a man named William Penn. Penn founded Pennsylvania to be a haven for people facing religious persecution, and to be a place where colonists and Indians could live in harmony. Penn's father had supported the monarchy, the king, during the English Civil War, so in gratitude, when the king's son came back, he granted Penn a large tract of land. Now, William Penn, as you might have guessed from the hat, is a Quaker, and he's especially concerned with making a refuge for other Quakers. Remember, Massachusetts does not like Quakers, England doesn't really like Quakers, Virginia doesn't really like Quakers, so they kind of need a place. Like the Puritans, Penn believed that his colony was a holy experiment. He wanted to establish what he called a free colony for all mankind. He wanted Pennsylvania to be governed by Quaker principles, like the idea that all people are equal in the eyes of God, even women and Indians and Africans. He wanted people to have a place to follow their own conscience. For Quakers, for people like William Penn, liberty is not something that only the nobles have. It's a universal, inborn entitlement. It's not something that comes from the king and can be taken away. Freedom is something that everybody ought to have. And that principle will eventually lead the Quaker Church to denounce slavery and become the single largest denomination in the abolition movement. And because Penn believes in the equality of all souls, he of course believes that Native people own this land, and that it ought to be bought fairly, and it ought to be bought fairly where both sides understand exactly what is happening. And he even offered land to nations that had been driven out of their homelands, like the Lenape, the Delaware. They had originally lived on the coastline in what is today the state of, 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count, but they'd been pushed out by the Iroquois Confederacy. and offers them land in Pennsylvania, and they live there in peace for quite a long time. It was absolutely essential that Pennsylvania maintain peace with Indian nations because Quakers are pacifists. They do not support violence. Pennsylvania didn't even have a militia until the 1740s. But religious freedom was Penn's most fundamental ideal. Pennsylvania offered religious toleration to anyone who believed in God and who didn't use their freedom to encourage others to badness. There was no official church in Pennsylvania. Whether you went to church at all was entirely up to you. But there were some limits. Anyone who believed in God could worship freely, but only Christians could hold office. And the Quakers did have a strict code of moral behavior that was enforced by the law. They outlawed swearing and drunkenness and adultery. They outlawed bull baiting and cockfighting, although not so much out of concern for the animals, more because people would get drunk and act a fool at those events. Your private internal religious belief is your business, but your public behavior, that was still very regulated. Because Penn is the proprietor, he has the right to choose the form of government. So he chose to establish a kind of democracy. He appointed some council members to come up with the laws and then to create an elected assembly, which would then vote on those laws. And voting rights in Pennsylvania were much easier to get than in most of the other colonies. You did have to own land, but only 50 acres. In Pennsylvania, that was very easy to get. You know, in other colonies, whether it's New York or whether it's Virginia, the people in charge usually gave most of the land and the best land away to their friends. But Penn didn't do that. He sold the land at a fair price. So the vast majority of men in Pennsylvania were able to vote. The climate and the religious toleration and the cheap land and the democracy all attracted immigrants, not just from England, but from all over Western Europe. Kind of ironically, the freedom that Pennsylvania offered to immigrants would eventually lead to a loss of freedom for other people. They were so successful at attracting settlers that colonial leaders after William Penn died began to get desperate for more land and revoke their policy of fairness toward the Indians so that they could just start seizing more land. And because Pennsylvania sold land off so cheaply, people who, before Pennsylvania, would have had to been indentured servants in the Chesapeake were able to go to Pennsylvania instead now and buy that land. And that loss of access to indentured servants at a time when the demand for labor is rising helped to shift the southern colonies more towards slave labor. And while all of this expansion is going on, there are also a lot of crises. The most probably dramatic uprising of the 1600s took place in Virginia. Virginia is where the first colony, the first English colony, was established. It has become incredibly corrupt. Now, this is only about 70 years after the colony was even founded, but you know, Virginia had never really been a fair place, even in the beginning. The governor of Virginia at this point, William Barclay, he's been in power for about 30 years. And he uses his power to give his friends and his supporters vast land grants and appoint them to important political offices. And planters who were connected to him monopolized the best land. They would invite indentured servants over with contracts that promised them land. But when the servants' terms were up, either they wouldn't get land at all, or the only land that was left was way out west, away from the rivers, which were the only real transportation, up in the mountains where there's no protection and you can't get your crops to market. Some of the former servants took that land. Many of them became the ancestors of today's West Virginians, who are on average still awfully poor and with not a lot of opportunity. And then some said, we can't make a living out on that land. It's bad land. We can't get the crops to market, so I guess we're just going to stay in town and become landless wage earners. It's an awful choice to have to make. You can either go out west where it's dangerous and you can't make any money, or you work for wages and you never get enough land to be able to vote, which is exactly the situation that you were in before you became an indentured servant in the first place. Then the British government raised taxes on tobacco. That cut into everybody's profit a little bit, but it really hurt those small farmers, the ones who weren't buddies with the governor. By the 1670s, the poverty rate in Virginia was appalling. It was about a third of the population. It was getting close to the poverty rate in England itself. Settlers are demanding more land. They want militias to protect them. The governor's not listening. And this becomes Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was sparked by a really minor confrontation between Indians and colonists out on the Virginia frontier, but it's got all of these underlying issues feeding into it. These settlers groups demanded that Governor Barclay remove all of those Indians, get them out of Virginia colony, and open up more land for white settlers, and the governor won't do it. Not because he cares so much about the Indians, but because he's getting a really nice profit from the fur trade, and he doesn't want to lose that. So the settlers responded by massacring Indian men, women, and children. And then Nathaniel Bacon steps in. Nathaniel Bacon turns some legitimate grievances into a conflict between members of Virginia's elite. Nathaniel Bacon is not a former indentured servant. He is not one of these small farmers who's facing these issues out on the frontier. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy man. He was a very large planter. He is the son of a very wealthy, landed, noble family in England. He just isn't one of Barclay's friends. He believes that Governor Barclay is lesser than him. He's new money. Bacon's cronies, his friends, include some very wealthy men who are also descendants of nobility and also believe that the governor is not worthy of them, not on their level. And the fact that this man, who they saw as lower than them, had the power to give good land and give government jobs, really hacked them off. Bacon doesn't actually care. None of Bacon's wealthy supporters actually care what's happening to these indentured servants. They just want Barclay's power for themselves. But Bacon is really good at using the anger of those landless former servants. He demands lower taxes on small farms. He demands the removal of all the Indians. He demands an end to Barclay's corruption. And of course, all these small farmers are going, this guy has our back. That's awesome. We're going to follow him. So Bacon gathered a small army. They attacked some Indian villages. When the governor ordered him to stop, Bacon's men marched on Jamestown itself and burnt it to the ground. Governor Barclay fled. Bacon set himself up as the ruler of Virginia. He allowed his soldiers to plunder the estates of the governor and his friends, but he didn't actually make any of the changes that he said he wanted to make that would help them in the long term. And then a fleet of warships arrived from England to put down this rebellion, because, England doesn't pay that much attention to what's happening in the colonies, but this is a little bit too far. 23 of the leaders of Bacon's rebellion were hanged. Not Bacon himself. He died of the flu while he was in prison. The idea that former servants would join an uprising really spooked Virginia's elite. So the colony quickly reduced taxes, became much more aggressive toward the Indians, and started sending militias out west to protect these settlers. They also looked around and decided that they needed a labor force that would never be free to join a rebellion like this. They actually thought that if there were no free servants, that the rebellion wouldn't have happened. So Bacon's Rebellion is one of the reasons that Virginia, in the last 20 years of this century, shifted so quickly and so completely away from indentured servitude toward slavery. In the long run, Bacon's rebellion did benefit white settlers, but that benefit was gained by Indian removal and by just a massive amount of slavery. Now, other colonies were having issues too. Um, Probably the bloodiest conflict occurred in southern New England. In 1675, an Indian alliance launched attacks on Puritan farms and settlements, and it became probably the most violent conflict in this region in the entire 1600s. Most of the tribes that were a part of this alliance fought under their own leaders, but New England officials insisted that it was all caused by one man, that it was masterminded by a Wampanoag war chief named Metacom, who the colonists, for some reason, called King Philip. By this time, it's the late 1600s, whites outnumbered natives in the settled parts of New England. There were 90 Puritan towns, but within half a year, more than half of those towns had been attacked by these allied raiders. 12 of those towns had been destroyed. As the English refugees flee toward the coast, the line of English settlement was pushed back almost to where it originally was. Of the English population of about 52,000 people at that point, 1,000 died, and about 2,000 Indians died in the fighting. By the middle of 1676, the tide had started to turn. There was a counterattack by the colonists that broke the alliance apart. It didn't necessarily defeat, but sort of broke them apart so that they could be picked off individually. Now, not every Indian tribe in New England was a part of this alliance. Many of them banded together, but some of them actually allied with the English. Typically, the weaker tribes allied with the English to try and push back against their traditional enemies. And together, the English and their allies, over the next couple of years, will inflict devastating punishment on the rebels. Metacom was captured and executed. Indian villages were destroyed, and captives, including children, were killed or sold into slavery in the islands. Most of the survivors fled to Canada or New York. And then the colonists turned on their own allies, on Indians who had converted to Christianity. There were about 2,000, they were called praying Indians, who had converted to Protestantism and were living under Puritan supervision in separate neighborhoods in Puritan towns. Large numbers of them were forced into internment camps, essentially. The largest group were forced onto Deer Island in Boston Harbor, and supposedly they were sent there for their own protection, so that no one would mistake them for a hostile Indian and shoot them. But then the settlers didn't send supplies, and about half of them, there were about 1,000 to 1,100 originally, and about half of them starved to death or died of disease. Both sides committed atrocities in this conflict. Metacom and his allies were not innocent in this war, but neither were the settlers. But after this war, the image of native people as bloodthirsty became firmly entrenched in the colonists' mind. And problems in England were still spilling over into the colonies as well, as if we didn't have enough on our own soil to deal with. The long struggle over who will control the English government comes to a head. Will it be the king? Will it be the parliament? That is the argument that has been dominating England this entire century. They'd already had a civil war. Then they restored the monarchy with the understanding that these new kings would allow Parliament to have more power. Under that first Restoration king, under Charles II, that had worked. Parliament had gained control of finances and foreign affairs, and they had passed laws to keep anyone who was not Anglican, who was not a member of the Church of England, from having political or religious power. And that was fine when Charles was king. But when Charles died in 1685, he had upwards of 20 children, but none of them were children that he had with his actual wife. So he's got no legitimate sons to take the throne, and the throne passes to his brother, James, the Duke of York. He's the guy who's had been governing New York. He becomes King James II. He is very different from his brother Charles. First of all, he's Catholic, and he believes in the divine right of kings. He believes that he is king because God wants him to be king. Therefore, everything that he does is approved and ordained by God, and anyone who challenges him is essentially challenging God. This is a recipe for disaster. James issued a royal decree of tolerance for Catholics and for Protestant dissenters, and Parliament said, you can't do that. And James said, well, I think I can. I am the king by God's will. And Parliament said, no, we literally just, right before your brother died, we passed a law specifically saying, you can't do that. And James said, by God, I am. Everyone who has lived through the rest of the 1600s saw exactly where this conflict is heading. So to prevent another civil war, they try and find a way to get James out of power without him bringing up an army. James has 3 children. His son is Catholic, and also a child, way too young to rule. His daughters are married to Protestants. So they invite James's oldest daughter, Mary, and her husband, who are both Protestants. They invite William and Mary to come be the joint rulers of England. The idea behind this was James will probably not try to kill his own daughter. And I gotta tell you, in some members of the English royal family, that would have been a stupid assumption to make, but it worked this time. James fled. He fought sort of only, he fought a couple of battles, but like his heart really wasn't in it, and he wasn't even really trying, so he basically just ran away. The elite and the church flocked to support William and Mary, and with hardly any real bloodshed, the Glorious Revolution was complete. The Glorious Revolution is called that actually because it was almost bloodless. And it fully entrenched the idea that when it comes to the rule of law, Parliament makes the law, and everyone, even the king, has to obey it. To justify overthrowing James, and to calm down anyone who might be concerned about that, Parliament passed a Bill of Rights that listed the powers of Parliament, but also listed the rights of individuals, including trial by jury, no cruel and unusual punishment, can't fine a man for a crime unless he's actually been convicted. And the Bill of Rights expressly said these are the liberties of all Englishmen by right of their birth as Englishmen. Now, you may be looking at those rights, the rights of individuals, and saying that's not any different from the Magna Carta, so why does this matter? It matters because the Magna Carta, which we talked about in the first lecture, said that those rights were granted by the king. This new Bill of Rights says that these are the rights of all Englishmen by virtue of their birth as Englishmen. It is not the king granting them. And if the king doesn't grant it, the king can't take it away. The next year, Parliament passed a Religious Toleration Act that allowed any Protestant dissenter to worship freely. Although it still said only Anglicans can have political power. The Glorious Revolution exposed some of the cracks in colonial society. It spills over here, and it gives colonial elites an excuse to try and seize more power for themselves. Until the mid-1670s, England's North American colonies had basically ruled themselves. Like, governors and proprietors can be appointed by the crown, but once that was done, England basically ignored them. As long as there wasn't an uprising or a rebellion and the trade was still flowing, England really didn't care. But when James comes in, then England had tried to take more control of the colonies. They established a commission to oversee colonial affairs. The commission had the devil of a time trying to get the colonies to obey. Um, the king had revoked Massachusetts' um, colonial charter because Massachusetts would not obey some of these laws. In fact, he took all of the New England colonies, um, Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Colony, New Haven, Hartford, took all of those little New England colonies and did away with all of their individual governments. He put them into one like super colony and appointed one of his friends to rule them. And they didn't get to have any more elected assemblies. They didn't get to have their town councils anymore because James was so mad that they weren't obeying these laws. So New England colonists are not angry to see James get overthrown. When news of this glorious revolution reaches North America, it sparked several rebellions. The Boston militia seized the governor that James had put into power, seized him and some other officials and threw them in jail. And then those New England colonies broke apart and tried to reinstate their original governments that James had taken away from them. In Maryland, a group of Protestants overthrew their new proprietor, the new Lord Baltimore. And all of these different groups claimed that they were acting in the name of English liberty. And they expected the new king and queen to approve. Not all of them got that approval. King William agreed that Lord Baltimore had mismanaged Maryland. So he did allow a new Protestant-led government to be established. Catholics kept the right to practice their religion in Maryland, but they lost their voting rights. So that ended Maryland's little experiment in religious toleration. In New England, though, it's a little different. Most of the New England colonies, the king allowed them to have their original charters back, but not Massachusetts. The new king was not very favorable toward Puritanism, and Massachusetts in particular had a bad reputation as this hotbed of religious persecution against Baptists, against Quakers, against everybody, against themselves sometimes. So William issued a new charter that transformed Massachusetts' political structure. They were allowed to keep their town councils, but he said that you could no longer make church membership a requirement for voting. The king now appointed the Massachusetts governor instead of letting the colonists elect him. So Massachusetts became a royal colony, technically governed by the king, and the new majority of voters were not hardcore Puritan church members. And the king also required Massachusetts to abide by that Toleration Act and allow all Protestants to worship freely. This downfall of the Puritan church greatly benefited the merchants and the large landowners who start to dominate now the government. Okay, so when we move on to the next lecture, we'll talk about how the colonies start to stabilize after all of the upheavals and ridiculousnesses of the 17th century. We'll talk about growth of diversity in the colonies, and then of course we'll start to push closer toward the colonies' break with England itself.